Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hey, my dear friends, tonight we wander into a world of gentle shadows and soft gaslight, where carriages creak and shoes touch damp stones, and the breeze holds the scent of cold smoke and rain. You feel lace brushing your wrists, a quiet smile fixed in place, and countless unspoken regulations pressing on your shoulders. Soon we will drift through sitting rooms and hidden lanes, through whispered scandals and curious remedies, and you likely won't get through this without a faint blush or two. So before you make yourself cozy, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I create here. Tell me where you are listening from and what time it is, because the evening feels unique in every location. Now lower the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for that gentle background whisper. And let's drift into tonight's adventure together. You stand in the mist that Londoners call a pea souper, a thick golden haze spun from countless chimneys and factory smokestacks. Gas lamps glow like captured moons along the boulevard. This city thrives on appearances, and every show needs careful staging. You sense it in your garments. Your collar is starched to a crisp point. Your gloves declare you are clean even when the streets are not. Being respectable forms the low note in this era's melody. A steady hum promising structure, wealth, and authority. Beneath it, another rhythm quietly stirs. Bodies longing and worry converse in attics and cellars while the drawing room discusses weather and worship. You pass a shop display filled with hair oils and colognes. Antimacassars drape over chair backs inside. Those small cloth shields meant to protect upholstery from the oily touch of Macassar hair products. It is a small domestic detail, almost endearing, yet it hints at an obsession with surfaces. The sofa must appear spotless, even when the people sitting on it are complicated. You smile at how the city fusses over cleanliness. Then you catch the river at low tide and decide that fussing makes perfect sense, like just one. If purity is akin to holiness, the Thames right now is somewhere in distant suburbs. Queen Victoria sits at the core of this universe, ruling from 1837. Her name has become shorthand for an age, but she also remains a living woman with 9 children, daily strolls, and a fondness for steady routines. The journals use her family as a moral beacon. Domestic goodness shines from the palace windows, even on nights when the mist swallows their gleam. You notice that proper society loves to discuss home and obligation. It worships the idea of virtue. It recites guidelines like grace before dinner. Those guidelines say men and women occupy separate realms. Women are angels of the household. Men stride into the public world. You try on these roles for fit and feel seems pinch at your sides. Scholars still debate whether Victorians were as proper as jokes suggest or simply acted proper in public while writing very open letters in private. The myth claims people covered piano legs so no one would be aroused by mahogany ankles. You peek into a parlor and find crisp covers over furniture, but the truth is slipperier than the punchline. Some homes did fret at that level. Many did not. Historians still argue whether the leg-covering tale grew from satire, missionary enthusiasm, or the human fondness for a silly rumor that confirms a stereotype. You set it aside as a curiosity. It rests beside another odd collectible, the mustache cup, a teacup with a porcelain guard that keeps waxed whiskers tidy while you sip. Unusual, practical, and just vain enough to be charming. You walk and the city performs. Theatres sparkle, music halls flirt, and religious pamphlets are sold on corners, promising self-betterment. A preacher announces a temperance meeting with a voice like a bell. A chemist's window displays rubber goods with vague labeling, the way a magician leaves a card partly visible then pretends not to notice. You realize the entire street is a dialogue about restraint. From the corset that guides the body into a stylish shape to the sermon that channels desire into marriage, everything asks you to be manageable. The corset is not merely clothing. It is a metaphor that creaks as you inhale. Tangible fact slides in as smoothly as a carriage wheel on newly paved asphalt. Gaslighting expanded through the first half of the century, reshaping nights into usable time and giving the metropolis an extra shift of work, leisure, and temptation. Light lengthens the hours during which people might roam, meet, and find mischief. Police patrol with more confidence in the glow. Shopkeepers measure their profits by the lamp. You sense the moralists recalculating too. If the night now behaves like day, then the rules must grow taller. Your boots carry you past a medical shop where anatomical models stand behind glass. A pamphlet in the window warns about youthful overindulgence, the sort of text that lists symptoms so broad it might as well claim that blinking twice is a moral failing. You chuckle softly. Just 2. If all those symptoms are genuine, everyone within 5 blocks is doomed by bedtime. The pamphlet is bait for the anxious. Anxiety is profitable in this era. Publishers discover that a hint of scandal sells copies. Doctors discover that naming a worry gives them authority to treat it. Parents discover that fear sells innocent-looking devices through mail order. You tuck these observations in your pocket for later, because tonight begins with moods and murmurings, not prescriptions. You step into a drawing room where the clock ticks like a courteous tap on the shoulder. Conversation moves in graceful circles. People discuss music, charity fairs, and a cousin's newborn. Words skim the surface of a deeper lake. Courtship rules hover nearby. The dance of calling cards, chaperones, and carefully timed departures. You can feel the weight of being watched. You sit straighter and smile more warmly, as if the room were grading you. The piano plays a tender song about hearth and home. The singer closes her eyes on the high note. Everyone applauds, relieved to have felt something safely. Somewhere nearby, an opera cloak hangs heavy with perfume. In an alley, a poster promotes a lecture on purity at the Mechanics Institute. In a club, men laugh too loudly, then grow quiet when the steward passes. The city is a collage of compartments, each with different permissions. Your mind keeps tiptoeing to the spaces between compartments. Who crosses them and at what cost? Scholars still argue whether the average person believed the public script without question or negotiated it like a maze. Obeying here, bending there, inventing small rituals to get through. You feel the maze beneath your feet. At the seaside, when summer arrives, you would find bathing machines, those quaint wooden huts on wheels that roll a bather into the waves for modest plunges. That is an authentic Victorian contraption, both practical and amusing. You imagine yourself wheeled into the water like a dignified tea bag. Just 3. You bob, you steep, you emerge lightly scented with sea and minor regret. Devices like that are emblems of the age. They insist you may enjoy your body, but only within a fenced rectangle with a curtain. You return to the street and let the mist wrap you like a shawl. The lamps hiss, hooves clop. Somewhere a baby cries and someone sings a lullaby that keeps missing the same note. You feel how fear patrols the borders of pleasure. The fear says desire is a wildfire. It says the household is a dry forest. It says a spark can destroy everything. So people build buckets, drills, and fire breaks. They create etiquette and censorship. They load words like purity and duty with the weight of bricks. They want to sleep peacefully at night, which means they want the night to behave. Your breath clouds in the cold, and you count the rhythms again. Reputation above, whispers below. This is the stage on which every later scene will play. From the sermons that accuse to the surgeries that promise cures. From scandalous exposés to secret ledgers kept by men with neat handwriting and long memories. For now you walk the prologue, you touch the furniture, you read the advertisements, you notice the seams in a glove and the gap under a door. The city keeps its eyes on the surface. You listen for what moves underneath. Patience has paid off. You feel the city's hands straighten your spine. Morning turns the mist to a pale broth, and respectability lifts like a hymn. You smooth your gloves and practice the small smile that says you are agreeable, punctual, and averse to surprises. The street sounds crisp, a milkman's clink, a broom's rasp, a church bell's patient counting. Respectability is not a mood, it is a daily uniform. You tie it on like a cravat and you keep it clean. The day arranges itself into zones. In one zone, ladies call between 3 and 5, leaving their names on delicate cards. Initials looped like lace. A silver tray near the door becomes a social barometer, heaped with visiting cards like winter leaves. Corners turned down to signal messages. PPC means pour prendre congé, a goodbye before a trip. You learn the steps because every step is reputation. Just 1. You treat your calling card like a passport and your teacup like customs, declaring 2 sugars and no contraband gossip. The rules are fussy, but they keep friction low. If everyone plays nicely, nothing explodes, at least not in daylight. Within the home, the watchwords are order and decorum. The parlor faces the world, dusted and staged. Behind it, the kitchen smokes and hisses. The scullery swallows echoes, and the nursery smells like warm milk and chalk. You notice the division of labor has a soundtrack. Public rooms hum softly, back rooms clatter. The ideology that justifies it is simple and solemn. Men occupy the realm of work and politics. Women preside over the sanctified domestic shrine. Coventry Patmore gives the ideal a nickname with his mid-century poem, The Angel in the House, and you can feel that halo resting on every breakfast tray, every mended sock, every careful tone of voice, tangible fact. The phrase became a shorthand for the belief that a woman's moral influence redeemed the rougher world of men and should therefore remain carefully guarded. Outside, clubs thicken the air with cigar smoke and unhurried confidence. Men vanish into rooms with leather chairs and pink newspapers, returning at dinner with anecdotes about debates and horseflesh. The double standard walks at their elbow like an old friend. A gentleman may flirt on the edge of impropriety, may drink, may wander the theatre after hours, and still be invited to Sunday lunch. A lady's misstep is a cliff. If she falls, she does not land softly. You can feel the tilt of the scales and how habit makes the tilt look like nature. Scholars still argue whether the average man truly believed his indulgences were harmless while female lapses were catastrophic, or whether he simply liked a moral system that arranged the cushions under him. You examine your clothes. The corset tugs, the crinoline blooms around you, and the boots pinch with honest sincerity. People mutter that fainting couches exist because women drop like autumn apples. But you notice heat, heavy fabric, stale air, and tight lacing are a quartet that would make anyone dizzy. The quirky detail you pocket today is a crinoline lifter, a discreet little hook-and-stick contraption that lifts your bell-shaped skirt so you can manage stairs or dodge puddles without broadcasting your ankles like scandal fireworks. Devices like that are the civilization of modesty. You may move, but only after clearing it with engineering. Etiquette manuals reign on side tables. Mrs. Beaton offers household management with the gravity of a field manual. Conduct books advise when to speak, when to smile, and how long to stay so as not to haunt a sofa like a friendly ghost. They assure you that self-restraint is beauty, that poise confers safety, that your posture is a public letter. You realize how much energy leaks into self-policing. A laugh gets trimmed. A story is declared not quite the thing. The boundaries hold because people want to keep their invitations, their prospects, their calm, and because fear is expensive. A rumor can consume a year's worth of carefulness in an afternoon. The law reflects the slant. Tangible fact. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 moves divorce from an Act of Parliament into a civil court, but it sets a bar that is lower for husbands. A man may petition for divorce on grounds of adultery alone. A wife must prove adultery plus an aggravating factor like desertion or violence. You feel that detail like a pebble in your shoe that somehow becomes the whole walk. The wedding ring is a circle, but the rule book is not. At the same time, married women's property acts begin to loosen the knot later in the century, letting wives own and control earnings and inheritances. Scholars still argue whether those reforms sprang from pure liberal principle, pragmatic economics, or the noisy collision of scandal, activism, and industrial change. Courtship performs on a narrower stage. You present a calling card to a father, sit across from a chaperone at tea, and speak in delicate code. Flowers say more than sentences. Floriography turns the parlor into a botanical telegraph. Red roses for love. Geraniums for true friendship. Basil if you really want to start a fight with a salad. Another oddity grins from a corner of the garden. Men wear bachelor's buttons, cornflowers said to wilt if the wearer's love is unreturned. You pin one on and try not to peek every 5 minutes like a nervous weather forecaster. Jest 2. If the blossom droops because you forgot to water it, the omen department will not issue a refund. And yet within the lace cage there are levers. A woman may bring a breach of promise suit if a fiancé vanishes with a shrug and a new hat. Newspapers cover these trials with relish, itemizing broken hopes like a ledger of grievances. Social capital can be weaponized with a calm smile. Motherhood confers authority in certain rooms. Charity committees empower organizing minds. The lines are strict, but people learn to write along them with elegant loopholes. You watch an aunt broker a favorable introduction with the precision of a stock trader, then claim she merely happened to seat two compatible souls together. You hear the Sabbath coming before you see it. Sunday turns streets into quiet ribbons. Respectability loves Sundays, family pews, hats like small ships, sermons with polished thunder. Ministers preach about purity and self-command. You sit and count the moments when the pews rustle, when someone coughs, when the word temptation lands with a soft thud like a plum. The gospel of respectability is not only religious, it is also economic. A tidy household implies solvency. A clean doorstep implies punctual rent. The front steps get scrubbed to a gleam because neighbors are the first market. Children absorb the script early. Boys are drilled into aspiring breadwinners. Girls are trained into domestic diplomats. Toys echo the plan. Tiny cookstoves, doll cradles, printing presses, tin soldiers. You hold a fan and learn that in some circles people claim a secret language of fan positions. Whether or not the code is real, the performance certainly is. A flutter becomes commentary. A snap becomes an exclamation point. Scholars still argue whether the fan language ever functioned as a reliable system, or mostly as charming folklore that magazines exaggerated into a Victorian meme. Either way, you find your wrist learning to speak in breezes. At table, you watch men talk politics, while women discuss charity bazaars, though everyone notices everything. The double standard is not invisible, it is simply normal. A gentleman's extramarital detours are chalked up to high spirits. A woman's are canonized as cautionary tales. You sip, nod, and feel how tight ropes become sidewalks when the city agrees to pretend. Jest 3. You picture a public safety poster. Remember to look both ways before crossing a rumor. Night approaches again, and the lamp wicks bloom with fire. You sense the pressure of respectability most sharply at twilight when choices multiply. Do you go to a lecture on temperance or to a concert with a friend who tells wickedly funny stories, or home to read by the hearth where the cat has annexed your chair? Every option carries a profile. You are always curating your silhouette against the gaslight. You realize that the era's most terrifying magic trick is not in the back rooms we will soon explore, but in the parlor's mirror, which trains you to police yourself so thoroughly that no constable is needed. As the bell tolls the hour, your steps slow. You imagine the city as a great wardrobe, every door a moral costume. You run a hand along a sleeve of duty, a cuff of propriety, a collar of caution, and think how soft they feel against the skin, how they itch after a while, how some people would rather scratch than speak. Respectability promises safety if you never go barefoot. You promise yourself to watch what happens when shoes come off. You step into a school dormitory where the straw mattresses smell faintly of soap, and boyish bravado and the master's footsteps click like metronomes of good behavior. On each bedside table sits a little book with a big warning, the sort of tract that uses solemn phrases like self-abuse and secret sin, as if the vocabulary itself might frighten anyone straight. You turn a page and meet diagrams of nerves and hollow-eyed youths. The captions insist that private habits drain the body like a leaky system. Jest 1. The author claims a single evening alone could empty a person faster than a teapot at a gossip meeting. The tone is thunder in miniature stuffed into a pocket paperback. This is the era's favorite medical ghost story. It has a name with Latin smoke around it. Spermatoria, the notion that a man might waste away from an imagined chronic loss of vital essence. Doctors warn of spinal weakness, poor eyesight, stooped posture, melancholy, even madness. Tangible fact. The idea saturates 19th century medical literature. From British manuals for youths to heavy treatises, writers like William Acton, whose 1857 book on reproductive health thuds onto many a Victorian desk, portray masturbation as a corrosive threat to mind and body. You can feel the pressure build in boarding schools, in vicarages, in city flats, where sighs sound louder after curfew. A whisper becomes a rule becomes a market. The market offers comfort disguised as hardware. You browse a discreet catalogue and find anti-masturbation rings that promise vigilance after lights out. Some with tiny teeth to discourage nocturnal handling, others smooth but designed to chafe if misused. There are straight-sleeve nightshirts, mittens stitched to winter flannel, and belts that lock like a traveler's money pouch. A Jugum device clamps desire the way a paperweight tames a stack of bills. Quirky tidbit. One inventor even touts a bedside alarm that rings if the sleeper shifts into a forbidden posture, meaning your worst enemy becomes not temptation but your bed behaving like a tattletale clock. You imagine the midnight chaos in a dormitory, bells pealing like a ship entering harbour while boys swear they were only chasing a dream about cricket. You flip the catalogue closed and feel how fear and ingenuity shake hands. It is easier to buy a mechanism than to unravel a myth. The myth arrives by way of learned men in wigs. An earlier century Swiss physician Tissot gave the scare a scholarly foundation that the Victorians eagerly inherited, adding their own varnish of statistics, asylum casebooks and sermon thunder. Hospital ledgers mark self-abuse as cause or symptom with the ink of certainty. The diagnosis becomes a convenient bucket into which worries about youth, class and urban temptation can be poured without needing to name them. Scholars still argue whether those ledgers record causes or merely reflect the prejudices of their keepers, filtering complex distress through a single fashionable explanation. You step from the dormitory into a chemist's shop where blue bottles catch the afternoon light. A mother stands at the counter asking in a whisper for something that might strengthen the nerves of her studious boy. The chemist nods gravely and offers tonics, cod liver oil, advice on fresh air, and the kind of stern pamphlet that scolds while it sells. Diet reformers join the chorus. They recommend coarse bread, porridge and vegetables to keep the blood cool and the imagination dull. John Harvey Kellogg, An American figure whose books find their way across the Atlantic, praises plain foods and routine. You eye a sample of pallid breakfast flakes and wonder if this is cuisine or penance. Scholars still argue whether cornflakes were invented with chastity as an explicit goal or retroactively sprinkled with that legend like sugar. The man certainly preached blandness as moral hygiene, but cereal history is messier than a tidy box suggests. At home, parents receive advice columns so detailed they could pass for military orders. Keep the child busy, keep the hands visible, keep the sheets cool, inspect the books for pictures, separate beds, open windows. One manual suggests sewing a tiny bell at the hem of a nightshirt to make any stealth a jingling performance. Another claims cycling can be dangerous for girls because saddles awaken appetites best left asleep, and promptly recommends a new saddle shape that looks like an ottoman got stage fright. You note how products grow wherever fear waters the soil. Jest 2. If anxiety burned calories, the era could skip its morning calisthenics. You wander into a doctor's office where a patient complains of palpitations, headaches, and gloom. The physician listens, asks careful questions, then steers the conversation like a barge toward the perennial concern. Has the patient been excessive? Has he kept evil company, meaning himself? The room fills with euphemism, a kind of polite fog. The physician's bookshelf holds a spectrum of beliefs. Some texts bristle with warnings. Others, especially toward the century's end, begin to doubt the old thunder. A few pioneers suggest moderation rather than terror, or recognize that guilt can make people sicker than any secret habit. You admire the cautious courage of a marginal note that says simply, observe, do not assume. Across town, a girls' school practices a different choreography of vigilance. Chaperones multiply during nature walks. Needlework keeps hands and eyes busy. Raptures about poetry are domesticated into recitations with straight backs and tidy pauses. A headmistress instructs her staff to close the pianoforte after dusk because music inflames sensibilities, as if Chopin himself lurked under the lid with a matchmaking agenda. The double standard follows like a shadow. Boys are warned because their bodies are imagined as engines with too much fuel. Girls are cautioned because their virtue is imagined as thin porcelain that cracks if set near a flame. Tangible fact. Popular conduct literature throughout the century treats female purity as a family asset to be guarded, while medical men increasingly publish theories that women are naturally less libidinous. A claim Acton expresses with bland certainty. You watch a student blink at the claim and then carefully hide her skepticism behind a seam of embroidery. Newspapers feast on scandal. A sensational case names a quack who advertises miracle cures for lost manhood, selling silver pills and embarrassing consultations. The journalist writes with glee, scolding from the pulpit while counting the copies sold. You sense how the panic becomes entertainment that pretends to be a public service. The city is a theatre, the vice is the villain, the cure is the comic relief. Jest 3. If moral panic sold tickets, the box office at Fleet Street would never close. As evening descends, you return to the dormitory. The boys say their prayers with voices half sincere and half sleepy. Somewhere beyond the courtyard, a band plays in a public garden and laughter carries over the wall. The master makes his rounds, checking windows and quilts. You lie down and feel how the century's fearful imagination reaches into quiet rooms. It wants to manage the night. It wants a guarantee that bodies will behave when no one is looking. It ties ribbons to wrists, rings to skin, bells to hems. It believes the self is a disobedient apprentice who must be watched until he learns the tools. And yet you notice resistance even here. Jokes whispered under blankets. Friends who share better advice than pamphlets do. A kindly teacher who thinks brisk walks and chess are healthier than scolding. A physician who writes melancholy occasioned by worry instead of self-abuse because precision is also a form of mercy. Scholars still argue whether the panic ever truly ruled ordinary households or mostly haunted certain schools, pulpits, and journals. You trace the shape of the fear and find beneath it the ordinary wish to raise children who thrive, to pass quiet nights, to wake unashamed. The wish is tender, the methods are baroque. The panic sells certainty, life sells nuance. You pull the blanket to your chin, listen to the gaslight sigh, and learn the first rule of this city's deeper map. When desire meets anxiety, an industry appears and calls itself virtue. You lie awake in the dormitory's hush and feel the room bristle with hardware. The age that fears the night also loves a gadget, and here the two affections meet with buckles and brass. A matron tiptoes by, satisfied that every wrist is tucked, every sheet is smooth, every bell stitched to a hem lies quiet as a closed eye. You shift and hear the tiny sigh of leather, Somewhere a hinge whispers. You realize the Victorians have discovered a new frontier of domestic technology. Not labor-saving devices, but desire-sparing ones. The device on the bedside table calls itself the jugum, which feels like a word carved into marble. Its name means yoke, and that is the idea. It promises to yoke a body part to good behavior by placing a small frame where mischief begins and making mischief frankly inconvenient. Sometimes it is a ring with inward teeth that pinch if tested. Sometimes it is a smooth band paired with a locking belt. The pitch is plain, vigilance even during sleep. You run a finger along the cold metal and think how many fears are cooled by a key in a parent's pocket. Just one. The sales copy reads as if virtue were a rowdy tenant, and this is how you clamp the windows shut. You examine the textile cousins. There are restraint sleeves, long soft tubes that run from shoulder to wrist, stitched to the nightshirt, so hands meet and stay like penitent classmates. There are mitts with buttons at the cuff and cords that anchor to the waist tie. So any exploratory expedition becomes an awkward tug-of-war with your own pajamas. For girls, some suppliers recommend padded drawers or seam placements meant to frustrate friction. The designs are explained in such elaborate euphemism that you could teach a poetry seminar on them. The language drones about modest supports and guarding the delicacy of youth. You translate. Prevent rubbing, reduce opportunity, lull the house to sleep. Tangible fact slides into the lamplight. Mid-19th century reforms like Britain's Patent Law Amendment Act of 1852 made patenting cheaper and more centralized. The result was an explosion of little inventions. Tea strainers, mousetraps, mechanical toys, and yes, devices sold as preventive appliances. Catalogues and patent records in the later decades filled with sketches of belts, shields, alarms, and restraining garments. The culture that produces sewing machines and safety pins also produces this family of night watchmen. You feel how a technical age treats the human body as another machine to calibrate. The wrench sits beside the sermon. On a dresser rests a tubular alarm with a spring and a bell. The instruction sheet boasts that it rings if posture changes in a forbidden direction, which is a polite way of saying the device thinks it knows which way dreams tilt. You imagine an entire boarding house jolting awake because one sleeper chased a cricket score to the boundary rope. Quirky tidbit. A few models boast an adjustable sensitivity dial, the sort of thing that makes a nervous father feel like an engineer of innocence. You picture him adjusting it like a watchmaker while his son stares at the ceiling and contemplates the geometry of betrayal. Jest 2. Somewhere a bell tolls not for thee but for thy elbows. You step into a small surgery where a physician demonstrates a guardian belt to anxious parents. He explains the materials with calm pride. Kid leather for comfort, nickel-plated brass for strength, a tiny padlock whose key stays with mother or master. He speaks of ventilation, hygiene, the avoidance of chafing. He keeps the conversation resolutely technical, as if this were a harness for a wayward clock. The guardians nod, relieved to be doing something. In the corner, a trunk holds other props, scrotal supporters, cooling pelvic harnesses, for girls that redistribute pressure away from the saddle, and bed frames with crossbars to which sleeves can be tied without leaving marks. Scholars still argue whether such apparatuses lived mostly in catalogues, asylums, and certain strict schools, or whether they entered ordinary nurseries in meaningful numbers. The surviving evidence leans toward institutional use and anxious niche markets rather than universal practice. But diaries and purchase ledgers are shy witnesses. Across town, a museum cabinet displays a chastity belt labeled medieval. Visitors shiver. The docent murmurs about crusaders and keys. Later, scholars will point out that many of these belts are Renaissance jokes. 19th century fantasies or outright forgeries polished to thrill a modern audience. The Victorian display case loved a cautionary curio. It made anxiety feel historic, as if fear itself were a tradition worth respecting. Tangible fact. By the 20th century, curators publicly reclassified many ancient chastity belts as later fabrications or theatrical props. A corrective that complicates the simple story of iron underwear marching through the ages. You watch a couple read the new caption and look a little relieved, as if one ugly myth just lost its ironclad passport. You wander to a draper's shop that quietly stocks hygienic undergarments. The clerk uses a tone perfected by chemists and clergy. Linens are advertised as cooling to the passions, a phrase with the same scientific heft as a peppermint. Cycling outfits for women feature split skirts and redesigned saddles marketed as anatomic, a nod to the rumor that ordinary seats stir feelings like a music hall song. Scholars still argue whether those saddles were more about comfort, fashion, or panic, but the advertisements learn to wink at all three markets. You try one on in your mind and decide that if a saddle can guarantee moral serenity, it can probably also make tea. At the orphanage, bedtime is choreography. A row of small hands are checked, then tucked into sleeves. A matron locks a drawer with a careful click. She is not a villain. She believes in sleep and safety and the fragile future of the children under her care. She has been told that desire is a slippery slope whose bottom is sickness. She cannot treat an idea with a spoonful of syrup, so she treats a wrist with a button. The age makes such choices easy because they look like doing something. You watch a boy roll over, midst softly thudding, and remember how in the last room a doctor who doubted the old thunder wrote, "Melancholy occasioned by worry instead of a fashionable diagnosis. Two traditions coexist, the belt and the pen." Newspapers lampoon quack devices while printing their advertisements. On the next page, a satirist draws a cartoon of a bed sprouting springs, gears, and a lighthouse beam that swivels if a knee bends. It is funny until you remember the fear beneath it. Jest 3. A caption suggests an upgrade that plays Rule Britannia, when virtue wavers, which would probably cure desire and sleep in one go. The editor chuckles, collects the printer's bill, and leaves the moral arithmetic to his readers. You lean against a window and count the motives. There is sincere love wedded to bad theories. There is commercial shrewdness that sniffs a profitable panic. There is institutional convenience. A ward sleeps easier when the staff believes it has neutralized temptation. And there is the broader Victorian appetite for self-mastery turned into hardware. This is the age of time discipline, of punch clocks and timetables, of temperance pledges and ledgers. It believes the self is improvable by routine and restraint. A belt is simply a timetable made visible. Not every story ends in buckles. A few families quietly ignore the pamphlets and choose walks, hobbies, and trust. Some doctors advise plain talk instead of apparatus, and some schools adopt sports and fresh air rather than bells and straps. By the 1880s and 1890s, a slow minority begins to murmur that the panic overshoots, that shame causes harm, that bodies are less fragile than sermons claim. Scholars still argue whether that murmur grows from new science, changing class anxieties, or the weary realization that a household cannot live as a locksmith's catalogue. You listen to the murmur and think how reform often begins as a neighborly aside. Night folds itself over the city. You pass one last bedside where a key rests on a saucer, bright as a moon sliver. The sleeper breathes in a steady line. The bell does not ring. You stand and study the hush and understand the logic that built these objects. If virtue is self-control, then a tool that controls the self must be virtuous too. But the room also teaches another lesson, the one the century keeps trying to avoid. A soul is not a cabinet to be locked. A body is not a crank to be tightened. The alarms can sound, the belts can bite, the sleeves can bind, and still the night belongs to dreams, not to devices. You step into the corridor, let the gaslight draw a soft path ahead, and leave the hardware behind like a row of sleeping beetles. You leave the creak of belts behind and step into a genteel consulting room that smells of lavender and carbolic. The fire murmurs. A folding screen throws lacy shadows across a chaise that looks like it got a scholarship in napping. The physician greets you with a grave kindness, his stethoscope heavy as etiquette. A maid pours water. Somewhere down the hall, a clock sighs. You sit, and the conversation opens with a word that has followed women across centuries like a persistent draft: hysteria. The term claims roots in the Greek for womb, hystera, as if a single organ could be both engine and scapegoat. Tangible fact. Throughout the 19th century, the diagnosis becomes a catch-all for exhaustion, irritability, anxiety, headaches, palpitations, insomnia, and a dozen other miseries, so elastic that it fits glove-like over very different lives. The doctor listens and nods, taking notes that mix observation and expectation. Your appetite wanes when your schedule knots. Your heart drums at night. Your shoulders live in the up position. You try to say that the house is loud, the baby colicky, the budget a puzzle with missing pieces, and your days stitched together by everyone else's needs. He writes, nervous excitability and uterine congestion. He is not cruel. He is a man trained to translate experience into 19th century categories. Medicine loves a tidy map, even when the country is ragged. Treatment begins with decorum. Rest, the doctor says, and quiet, milk and beef tea. No novels that quicken the pulse. Moderate walks if the air behaves. A rest cure imported from fashionable clinics, and the writings of eminent men prescribes bed, isolation from troublesome relations, massage, and a strict diet like a hymn sung to regularity. You realize the cure often looks like house arrest with snacks. Jest 1. Your only contraband is a book smuggled between two boring ones, the literary equivalent of a chocolate tucked in oatmeal. For the persistent knot in the lower abdomen that practitioners call pelvic congestion, the doctor recommends local massage, described in such careful euphemism that the air fogs with propriety. He speaks of mobilizing tissues, relieving obstruction, inducing a therapeutic paroxysm to reset a system imagined as overwound. He keeps his tone steady, technical, as if he is tuning a clock. The patient is screened. The hand is professional. The vocabulary builds a wall tall enough to keep blushes from climbing over. You notice how language works like furniture, arranging distance and comfort at once. If the physician tires because wrists and manual machines volunteer, clinics experiment with water jets at hydropathic spas, directed with the seriousness of artillery but aimed at nerve and muscle. Electricity joins the menu. On a side table purrs a magneto-electric apparatus, all polished wood and brass, its crank promising a disciplined buzz. Quirky tidbit. A few city establishments acquire steam or treadle-powered vibratory contraptions the size of small pianos, operated like respectable machinery. Their pulleys and belts are hymns to the age that solved everything with motion. The operator keeps the conversation polite, the screen in place, the hands in gloves. The entire scene is a choreography of modesty around a treatment everyone pretends is purely mechanical. You glance at the bookcase. There sit monographs on female diseases, thick as fruitcakes, offering diagrams that declare authority with every engraved line. Across the channel, Parisian neurology holds theatrical Tuesday lessons where a charismatic professor demonstrates hysteria in front of rapt audiences. Sketch artists dash off plates for newspapers that cross the channel with gossip speed. London society reads, thrilled and a little shocked, as if peeking through the curtains at science's private life. You sense that performance and diagnosis braided together here. A spectacular symptom earns a spectacular theory. Yet the quiet symptoms, the slow kind that come from being pressed flat between duty and silence, rarely get a stage. A woman physician enters your story, her cap neat, her letters of qualification hard-won. She listens in a new key. She suspects that some patients are not frail by nature, but starved of sleep, fresh air, autonomy, or sympathetic conversation. She prescribes club meetings, long walks, paid help where possible, and sensible corsetry instead of gladiator-grade lacing. She thinks a pen and a quiet room are as therapeutic as any tonic. She earns frowns and gratitude in unequal measure. In London and Edinburgh, a handful of women doctors open surgeries and dispensaries that feel like clean, well-lit rooms in a labyrinth, small sanctuaries where a diagnosis is not a verdict, but a conversation. The pharmacy downstairs contributes its own chorus. Bromides for nerves, chloral for sleep, quinine to sharpen the world, valerian to soften it. Tonics promise iron for blood, phosphates for brain, and sunshine in a bottle for souls that keep forgetting to open the blinds. You study the labels and suspect that many of these remedies are half chemistry, half ritual. Swallowing something feels like doing something. Jest 2. If tonics could invoice for placebo effect, every chemist's boy would retire at 20 with a pony. Even as treatments multiply, the word hysteria swells like a bell that keeps being rung. It becomes a justification for interrupting a woman mid-sentence, for dismissing anger as a passing cloud, for confusing grief with weakness. A merchant's wife complains of chest pains and is told to lie down. Her husband complains and is checked for his heart. The double standard curls through the clinic like smoke. Some patients accept the label because it means the ache has a name. Others feel erased by it, transformed into an emblem instead of a person. You realize a diagnosis can be a blanket or a blindfold. A rumor rustles through the journals about an English inventor's little hand machine that relieves the physician's fatigue. Advertisements later in the century will sell household models promising relief for nervous conditions with coy economy of detail. Scholars still argue whether doctors in Britain routinely used such devices to treat hysteria, or whether the now popular tale exaggerates a scattered practice tangled with marketing and later myth. The surviving papers and patents leave plenty of fog between the brass and the bedside. You picture the truth as a street seen through London rain. Shapes you can make out, details you cannot, certainty refusing to cross. In the quiet between appointments, the doctor admits that hysteria is a label of last resort. When a symptom refuses to behave, it is called nervous. When a life refuses to fit its tight corset, it is called hysterical. He does not say it unkindly. He is a man shaped by his shelves. He prescribes a seaside month. He promises to write a letter that will coax a relative into funding the rest cure. You nod. Seaside air cannot mend every sorrow, but it does sand the sharp edges off a week. Also, there are biscuits, which are medicine adjacent. Jest 3. The British Empire may run on tea, but its outpatient department runs on shortbread. You rise from the chaise and step back into the city where parlours double as clinics, where a fainting couch catches more than fainting, and where screens allow medicine to touch what manners forbid. The lamps have begun to glow. In your pocket, a small bottle clinks, iron tonic with an optimistic label. You think of the patients you met today, the one whose grief was told to behave, the one whose back hurt from lifting a toddler, the one whose heart jumped like a telegraph because she sleeps 5 hours in 2 shifts. Their bodies send telegrams. The wires hum. The operators answer in the code they know. You let the door close softly behind you and follow the pavement's steady logic. Tonight has taught you that a diagnosis can comfort and control, that euphemism can cradle and conceal, and that gadgets whisper to anxious ages like lullabies written in brass. Somewhere nearby, a screen slides on its track, and a doctor flexes his wrist or wheels over a machine that hums like a friendly beehive. The fire pops. A maid pours water. A parlour pretends to be a sanctuary while the city rehearses its next explanation for a woman's ache. You tuck the thought away, knowing the next room on this walk will offer sharper tools and a louder argument about cure and harm. You step from the parlour hush into a surgical theatre where skylight falls pale across wooden benches that slope like a bowl of watchful eyes. The air smells of ether and fresh sawdust, the antiseptic tang new to this generation of hospitals. Surgeons gather in their black coats, some still reluctant to don white smocks, their instruments gleaming like a sermon laid out in steel. This is the frontier where anxiety about desire crosses from pamphlets and tonics into scalpels and sutures. You feel the tension tighten like a violin string. The diagnosis on everyone's lips is hysteria, that flexible banner we glimpsed in the last room. But some voices grow impatient with massage, tonics, and seaside air. They claim that true cure demands bold hands. Ovarian disorders are blamed for nervous excitability. The logic leaps. If ovaries cause trouble, remove them. Tangible fact. In the 1870s and 1880s, a handful of British surgeons, notably Isaac Baker Brown, promoted ovariectomy or even clitoridectomy as treatment for hysteria, epilepsy, nymphomania, and chronic masturbation. They published papers with clinical calm, as if excising organs were as tidy as trimming a lampwick. You shiver, knowing that tidy prose hides human groans. Baker Brown ran the London Surgical Home, a private hospital where women with nervous complaints were admitted for what he called life-saving procedures. His rhetoric was paternal. He spoke of guardianship, of saving women from madness and family shame. He was not alone. A few colleagues echoed his views, but murmurs of dissent rose quickly. Other physicians bristled at his lack of consent, at his eagerness to wield the knife where patience might suffice. The profession split into factions, meetings growing heated, letters in journals sharp as scalpels themselves. Scholars still argue whether Brown believed sincerely in his cures or cloaked entrepreneurial zeal in a mantle of moral rescue. Either way, the storm gathered. You take your seat in the gallery. The theatre fills. An assistant arranges chloroform, that relatively new ally of surgery. A woman lies pale on the table, her breath fluttering under the cone. The surgeon explains his intention to remove an organ that he claims fuels nervous derangements. He speaks with the confidence of a man who thinks he is solving a puzzle rather than cutting into a life. You watch the students scribble notes, their faces somewhere between awe and unease, just one. Half of them will later brag they witnessed history. The other half will say they merely audited an argument with knives. The outcry against such radical procedures soon grows public. Newspapers catch wind of women operated upon without proper consent, of families shocked, of outcomes grim. Colleagues denounce Baker Brown in the Obstetrical Society of London, charging him with misconduct and cruelty. By 1867, he was expelled from the society, his reputation unraveling. Quirky tidbit. His downfall was accompanied by gossip that he once operated on a fellow physician's wife without explicit permission, a rumor that circulated with the energy of scandal and the satisfaction of professional rivalries sharpened by morality. His hospital shuttered, his name tarnished, though the debates he ignited rippled forward. Beyond Brown, other surgeons experimented with gynecological interventions. Cauterizations, excisions, ovariotomies justified as cures for menstrual irregularities or nervous complaints. Mortality rates remained terrifyingly high before antisepsis spread. Yet desperate families consented, believing surgery might save sanity. Tangible fact. Ovariectomy for true medical conditions like tumors did advance as a legitimate surgical field, with survival improving under antiseptic techniques pioneered by Joseph Lister in the 1860s. But when the knife drifted from treating disease to policing desire, the line between healing and controlling became faint indeed. You can feel the blade hovering not only over bodies but over autonomy itself. In quieter surgeries, less drastic methods persisted, cauterizing the cervix with nitrate of silver, scarifying tissues, prescribing leeches to draw congestion. These treatments wore the costume of science but echoed the same script. Sexuality as pathology. Patients learned to endure with stoic politeness, though diaries sometimes crackled with anger and confusion. Scholars still argue whether most women submitted silently, resisted fiercely, or negotiated with half compliance, shaping their own paths inside rigid options. The records show fragments. A refusal here, a second opinion there, a retreat into silence more eloquent than any petition. You visit a ward where patients convalesced after gynecological surgery. Curtains drawn, air heavy with disinfectant, a nurse reading psalms in a low, steady voice. Some women recovered and praised their surgeons for relief from pain or seizures. Others suffered infection, sterility, or death. Families whispered about whether it was worth the risk. The medical journals printed statistics, tidy columns of successes and failures, percentages that cooled messy stories into arithmetic. Just 2. The math insists 30% mortality is an acceptable risk, as if a family can bury 3 out of 10 loved ones and shrug. You raise your eyebrows at the arithmetic cheer. Meanwhile, feminists and reformers raised their own protests. Writers in journals and pamphlets argued that women's bodies were not laboratories for anxious men with scalpels. Some, like Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman doctor registered in Britain, warned against reckless surgery and stressed the importance of gentler treatments, hygiene, and respect. Their words pierced the fog of professional jargon, insisting that women deserved voices, not just incisions. They did not always win the argument, but they planted seeds in public opinion, shifting the conversation from hysteria as mystery to hysteria as perhaps misdiagnosis. You linger by a desk stacked with correspondence. A physician confides to a colleague that he dreads these operations, that he wonders whether the failures are buried in silence while the few successes strut in journals. Another replies that his duty is to prevent moral collapse by any means necessary. The letters reveal a profession in mid-crisis, divided between caution and zeal. You feel the very texture of Victorian medicine, part noble pursuit, part marketplace of remedies, part moral crusade with surgical gloves. Across the Channel, Parisian and German surgeons published similar experiments. Some continental clinics acquired reputations as harsher still. The transnational conversation fed into British debates, each side citing foreign statistics like chess moves. The patient, meanwhile, lay voiceless at the board's center. You close the journal and hear the sigh of a real woman in the ward down the hall, her breath shallow but steady. She is not a statistic. She is herself. The scandal of Baker Brown became a cautionary tale. His name appears in medical histories with a footnote of disgrace. His rivals used him as proof that surgery must be disciplined, not reckless. Yet his story also lingers as a reminder of how fear of sexuality can justify drastic acts under the cloak of cure. Scholars still argue whether he was an outlier or a symptom, whether his expulsion marked the profession's moral maturation or merely its need to tidy away a too visible zealot. The debate itself shows how uneasy the era was with the body's unruly mysteries. As you leave the theatre, the skylight dims to grey. The bench is empty, instruments clink into basins. You pass a cupboard where surgical gowns hang limp, smelling faintly of carbolic and sweat. The hush after surgery feels different from the hush after sermons. This silence is heavy, edged with the memory of cries. Just 3. You wonder if Victorian hospitals should hang signs reading "Caution, may contain morals," since half the procedures are about ethics disguised as medicine. Outside, the fog folds around you again. The street lamps flare. You carry the echo of steel on bone, the paradox of a healing art that sometimes wounded in the name of virtue. Tonight has taught you that fear and science make a dangerous duet when the score is desire. You adjust your collar, listen to the city's breath, and walk toward the next murmur, where law itself will stretch its hands into private lives. You step away from the clatter of surgical basins and find yourself in a garrison town where the air tastes of iron and spilled beer. Soldiers march in squares, boots chewing the gravel, drums marking time. Behind them, the streets tangle with taverns, music halls, and women whose glances carry both invitation and fatigue. The Victorian state peers into this world and decides that discipline must extend beyond the parade ground. Respectability may be a hymn in the parlor, but here it marches in uniform and its newest weapon is law, tangible fact. The Contagious Diseases Acts, first passed in 1864 and extended in the years after, authorized police in certain naval ports and garrison towns to detain women suspected of prostitution, subjecting them to compulsory medical examination. The idea is pragmatic on the surface. Protect soldiers and sailors from venereal disease, which weakens regiments more efficiently than any enemy musket. But the execution reveals the double standard sharpened to a bayonet's point. Only women are examined. Only women are punished. Only women are marked as vectors. You feel the injustice like grit in your teeth. A patrolman tips his hat as he escorts a young woman down a narrow lane toward the examination hospital. She has not been arrested for theft, nor caught in the act. Suspicion alone is enough. The officer needs only to believe she behaves as a common prostitute, a phrase as slippery as fog, granting him power. Inside, the examination is clinical in word but brutal in feeling. A speculum, cold as accusation, is used to inspect for infection. Consent is not a prerequisite, just one. The state that blushes at piano legs feels no shame peering far deeper when uniforms are at risk. You step into the receiving ward. Some women sit pale on benches, clutching shawls. Others stare with practiced detachment, having been through this ritual before. Those found infected are confined to lock hospitals, named for their locked doors, where they remain for months until declared clean. The confinement is justified as medical quarantine, but its reality is prison with bandages. A girl of 17 weeps, not because of pain, but because her employer dismissed her the moment rumors clung to her. Quirky tidbit. Inspectors recorded that even barmaids and seamstresses were sometimes caught in the dragnet, their independence mistaken for immorality, their reputations shredded by the mere whisper of suspicion. You hear the statistics recited in Parliament. Soldiers laid low, beds in military hospitals filled with syphilis and gonorrhea cases, efficiency drained. The Act supporters argued that regular inspections protect both the army and the women, offering them treatment rather than neglect. But critics quickly saw the darker shadow. Women reduced to instruments of state hygiene, while male clients marched on untouched. Scholars still argue whether the Acts genuinely reduced infection rates among troops or simply produced paper victories while pushing disease into quieter alleys. The data, like the city itself, refuses a tidy story. In London drawing rooms, reformers meet. Josephine Butler, a clergyman's wife with clear eyes and iron determination, rises to speak. She calls the acts a violation of women's dignity, surgical rape committed in the name of the crown. She tours towns, lectures tirelessly, gathers signatures for petitions. Her campaign grows into the Ladies' National Association for the repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts, an unusual movement in an era when women have no parliamentary vote but wield the power of conscience. You watch her speak to a hall packed with working women, artisans and students, her voice steady against hecklers. She frames the issue not merely as health but as justice. Why punish only one side of a transaction? The government bristles. Butler is lampooned in satirical papers as prudish, hysterical, or dangerously radical. She endures insults, even physical threats. Yet her cause gathers momentum. Newspapers print letters. Churches debate. Men of conscience join her ranks. The Acts become a moral battlefield where Victorian ideals of purity clash with Victorian habits of policing. Jest 2. Parliamentarians who can barely say the word speculum in public find themselves forced to discuss it for hours, red-faced but cornered by their own legislation. On the ground, the Acts shape daily lives. In Portsmouth, Plymouth and Chatham, women learn to watch their steps. A late return from a dance hall might invite suspicion. A walk with soldiers might brand them for examination. Families feared the disgrace of a daughter's name appearing on police registers. For some, the Acts pushed them deeper into clandestine work, hiding from patrols, seeking clients outside regulated districts. Scholars still argue whether the system created more danger by forcing sex work underground or whether it offered a fragment of healthcare otherwise denied. Meanwhile, the military's medical officers published charts and graphs, proud of their surveillance. They measured infections like accountants' tally coins. Their notebooks rarely mentioned the emotional wreckage of women examined against their will. In one ledger you glimpse a column of names, each followed by neat notes. Detained, diseased, discharged. No laughter, no despair, no tears, just ink pretending life is tidy. Jest 3. If neat handwriting cured shame, the entire empire would be virtuous by penmanship alone. By the 1870s, resistance hardened. Butler's movement petitioned Parliament repeatedly. Debates echoed with the language of liberty and morality. Some politicians argued the Acts were necessary evils. Others called them stains on the nation's conscience. The Acts were suspended in 1883 and repealed in 1886, a victory carved by persistent voices. Yet their memory lingers, a case study in how fear of disease can justify laws that pierce privacy and dignity. You leave the garrison town at dusk. Soldiers still march, taverns still glow, and women still navigate the margins. But you carry the sound of Butler's voice, calm and unflinching, as she calls a society to its better self. The Axe tried to sanitize desire by policing only one half of the equation, turning bodies into battlegrounds. The repeal proves that even in an age of moral thunder, resistance can grow in quiet halls, in petitions passed hand to hand, in women refusing to bow. The lamps flare in the street, and you walk on knowing the next corner leads not to statutes, but to the smoky pulse of nighttime entertainment. You drift from the garrison streets into the neon of their time. Gas lamps haloed in mist, music halls with painted signs, brothels tucked behind curtained windows. The night has its own economy, one that thrives precisely where daytime respectability scowls. A fiddler saws at a reel in a tavern doorway. The crowd spills ale and laughter. You feel the pulse of entertainment, survival and scandal beating together as inseparable as bass drum and melody. The music hall is your first stop. You squeeze onto a bench among sailors, clerks and factory hands. The air thick with smoke and orange peel. A singer struts across the stage in feathers, belting out a comic song that pokes fun at pompous magistrates. The crowd roars. Humor is rebellion disguised as rhyme. Tangible fact. Music halls flourished in the mid to late 19th century, offering a blend of comedy, song, dance, and risque performance that scandalized moralists, but delighted audiences from all classes. Some halls became palatial with balconies and chandeliers, while others remained smoky dens where spilled beer stuck shoes to the floor. The line between entertainer and sex worker blurs. A star with daring costume and suggestive wink may meet admirers after the show, her arrangements whispered through stagehands. Theatrical boarding houses shelter both struggling singers and those who trade favors for rent, just one. The backstage corridor doubles as both resume office and dating app, minus the swipes plus a lot more glitter. The city pretends to be shocked, but ticket sales stay steady, proof that the public likes its morality scolded by day and teased by night. Brothels stand only a few streets away. Their doors are discreet but not invisible, marked with curtains or a lamp left burning oddly late. Some houses are opulent, catering to officers and wealthy merchants, their rooms wallpapered in crimson flock, their parlors offering brandy. Others are cramped lodgings where women struggle to pay the madam's rent and the landlord's bribe. Quirky tidbit. One notorious brothel near Regent Street kept a live parrot that greeted clients with bawdy phrases, a detail repeated in memoirs with equal parts amusement and horror. You imagine the awkward silence when a man exits, coat skewed, only to be bid good night by a bird louder than his conscience. Scholars still argue whether sex work in Victorian London was predominantly an avenue of exploitation, or whether some women carved out niches of autonomy in a system stacked against them. Diaries and police records tell both stories. Girls barely in their teens trapped by poverty, but also seasoned courtesans who negotiated rents, arranged regular patrons, and sometimes retired with small savings. The truth resists neat categories. The brothel is a house of contradictions. Misery and mirth, abuse and resilience, velvet and vermin sharing the same staircase. You slip down a side street into a coffee stall open all night. It smells of pies, ink and coal. Men buy food after music halls close. Women linger at the corners, offering companionship. The transactions here are subtle. An exchange of glances, a walk to a rented room, money folded in a kerchief. Police stroll by, sometimes ignoring, sometimes arresting, depending on quotas, bribes, or personal mood. Jest too. If morality could be enforced by appetite, every meat pie would come with a free sermon. Instead, they come with mustard and a wink. The nightlife has its celebrities. Harriet Wilson, though earlier in the century, set the tone with her scandalous memoirs naming high-profile lovers. Later, women like Cora Pearl in Paris captured similar headlines, their portraits sold as cabinet cards in London. Music hall stars such as Marie Lloyd flirted outrageously with audiences, tilting lyrics until they meant far more than the censor allowed. She sang about knowing a young man, and the crowd laughed in the knowing way that made the censors look like unpaid marketing staff. Tangible fact. Lloyd was actually hauled before the Lord Chamberlain's office more than once for her cheeky repertoire, proof that official disapproval only raised her box office draw. You slip into a cabaret-style supper room where laughter clinks as loud as glasses. A comic sings, "A little of what you fancy does you good," and the crowd thunders approval. You notice how this becomes the anthem of the urban night, a philosophy that contradicts the pamphlets but nourishes spirits battered by 12-hour shifts. In a world of rigid propriety, the music hall and brothel provide relief, escape, and a crooked kind of equality. For a few coins, class boundaries blur, though never disappear. Police reports tally brothels by district, hundreds in London alone, ranging from grand houses of accommodation to dingy rooms above chandler's shops. The official response swings between tolerance and raids. Newspapers splash outrage about fallen women while running advertisements for theatres and novels filled with coy innuendo. Scholars still argue whether Victorian society was uniquely hypocritical or simply practiced the same doublethink as every era, just with more antimacassars. Jest 3. It's hard to take a lecture about purity seriously when the sermon's back page advertises mustache wax favoured by theatrical gentlemen. You pause at the edge of a narrow street watching a woman in ostrich feathers hurry with her cloak drawn tight. A boy runs past selling matches. Two officers loiter near a lamppost, weighing whether to intervene. Overhead, the gaslight flares and gutters. The night is a theatre with no curtain call, its players improvising survival. For some, the stage means ruin. For others, temporary independence. Either way, the audience is everyone. Neighbors, police, passers-by, clients judging, purchasing, pretending not to see. You leave the street and climb toward a quieter square where respectable houses sleep behind iron gates. The contrast is sharp enough to hurt your eyes. Tonight has taught you that the Victorian night is not absence of morality, but its mirror image. A carnival of contradiction where propriety pays to be mocked, where scandal is currency, and where songs outlive sermons. You tuck away the chorus, the parrot, the feathered cloak, and step on, knowing the next page of this walk will involve not laughter but outrage, when scandalous journalism forces daylight onto shadows. You walk through the square where daylight has returned, but scandal is louder than any street organ. A boy sells broadsheets with ink still wet, shouting headlines that make matrons flinch and young men grin. This is the summer of 1885, when London devours serialized reporting known as the maiden tribute of modern Babylon. Its author, W.T. Stead of the Pall Mall Gazette, has decided to prove that beneath gaslight glamour lies child exploitation too terrible to ignore. His prose burns like coal, painting the city as a monstrous Babylon devouring innocence. Tangible fact. Stead claimed to demonstrate how easily a child could be procured for sex, arranging the purchase of a 13-year-old named Eliza Armstrong with her mother's consent for a few pounds. Though she was removed from harm before any assault, the stunt shocked the nation and landed Stead himself in prison for abduction. The reports triggered outrage that led to raising the age of consent in Britain, from 13 to 16, under the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885. You hear the thud of legislation landing after years of hesitation, forced forward by scandal and print. The newspaper pages are lurid, describing beds with stained sheets, brokers of vice, girls drugged with chloroform. Readers sit trembling at breakfast tables, one hand gripping toast, the other the paper. Jokes in the street grow darker. One wag says London now has more amateur detectives than rats, and that is saying something. Just one. Your neighbor reads aloud a passage about wicked brothel keepers while carefully skipping the word seduction, only to trip over it 3 sentences later, blushing redder than his jam. You enter a parlor where respectable women form a reading circle. Normally the topic would be missionary newsletters or novels by Charlotte Yonge. Tonight, the Gazette dominates. Some women cry in anger. Others whisper about Stead's impropriety. How dare he expose his readers to sordid detail? Quirky tidbit. Sales of the Gazette skyrocketed so sharply that newsboys were mobbed. Reports say some buyers purchase stacks to resell at inflated prices, turning moral outrage into an impromptu stock exchange. It is the Victorian equivalent of a viral post. Shock, disgust, and a guilty eagerness to look again. You step into Parliament's gallery. The chamber hums with indignation, not only at child prostitution but at the journalist himself. Some MPs thank him for unmasking evil. Others accuse him of sensationalism and entrapment. They quote scripture, cite statistics, wave the Gazette in the air. The debate ends with hurried drafting of the Criminal Law Amendment Act, strengthening penalties for sexual exploitation and outlawing brothels where underage girls are kept. Scholars still argue whether reform owed more to Stead's dramatic reporting or to the persistent campaigning of women's groups like Josephine Butler's network, who had pressed the issue long before he made headlines. Perhaps it was both. tinder gathered by women set ablaze by a showman's match. The public response mixes horror and prurience. The same readers who gasp at the details also relish them, whispering to neighbors, imagining smoky rooms they would never otherwise see. The gazette's circulation tripled. Satirists lampooned Stead as a crusader who enjoyed too much the dirt he uncovered. One cartoon depicted him in knight's armor, rescuing a maiden while pickpocketing her purse. Jest 2. The caption reads, "The gallant editor proving even scandals about exploitation can be cross-examined with wit sharp enough to cut through armor." You visit a workhouse school where the pupils buzz with rumors. They have overheard that girls their age can be sold. Teachers hush them, but the whispers persist. The scandal proves that young people are not blind to what adults pretend to shield. Across the city, sermons thunder about national sin, while music halls insert cheeky references into comic songs. Scandal, once lit, dances into every corner, respectable or not. Stead's methods remain controversial. He staged a crime to reveal crime. He wrote with deliberate sensationalism, peppering his series with biblical metaphors of sacrifice and slaughter. He was prosecuted and imprisoned, serving 3 months. Scholars still argue whether his maiden tribute was responsible journalism or unethical showmanship that risked a child's welfare for headlines. Yet even his critics admit that without his storm, the law might have drifted along unchanged for years. The paradox stands. A man punished for abduction became the catalyst for reform that protected countless others. You picture Eliza Armstrong herself, the girl at the Scandal Center. After the furore, she was sent to a training home in the countryside. Her family endured notoriety. She later married and lived quietly, though the episode haunted her name. You realize that behind the sensational print, real children bore the weight of reform. Their lives did not reduce neatly to metaphors about Babylon. Evenings afterward, in drawing rooms and pubs, the debate continues. Respectable mothers warn daughters not to linger near strangers. Politicians boast of their part in raising the age of consent. Editors calculate the sales boost from mixing morality with melodrama. Jest 3. One printer tells his wife that sin sells better than sermons, then quickly insists he means only on the page, not in the pew. You step away from the newspaper stand, ears still buzzing with the arguments. Tonight has taught you how scandal can move laws faster than sober debate, how outrage requires both facts and theatre. The maiden tribute turned a sicky secret into a national obsession, its lurid paragraphs reshaping legal definitions of childhood itself. As you walk back into the fog, you realize that in this age, vice and virtue are business partners selling papers together, and that the loudest thunder sometimes comes from a press room, not a pulpit. You leave the newspaper cries behind and walk toward a hulking brick building with barred windows and a smell of boiled cabbage drifting through the night air. This is the workhouse, the Victorian institution that swallowed the poor and spat out the obedient. Its rules are as stiff as its walls. Here, poverty and morality are locked in an embrace so tight that you wonder which one is strangling the other. Inside, the air is heavy with disinfectant and despair. Rows of beds line a dormitory where women sleep in grey dresses that look like they were designed by a committee that hated colour. Each face tells a different story. Widows left destitute, young mothers abandoned, daughters cast out for shame. But in the registers, they are collapsed into a single phrase. Fallen. Tangible fact. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 reshaped relief for the poor, creating workhouses that offered food and shelter in exchange for grueling labor designed to deter all but the most desperate. Respectability was the price of a meal. You meet a girl of 18 scrubbing floors until her hands are raw. She once worked in service, but a child out of wedlock marked her. Families fearing scandal refused to employ her, so the workhouse took her in, branding her immoral in the same breath it offered gruel. Just one. You note that the Victorians claimed hunger was a moral tutor, though by the look of the soup it mostly taught despair. Reformers visit these institutions with Bibles and sewing kits. They call their efforts rescue, but the rescue often resembles punishment softened with hymns. In the so-called Magdalen homes, women deemed prostitutes or at risk of becoming so are confined under the banner of salvation. Days begin with prayer, continue with laundry, end with silence. Quirky tidbit. In one home, women were required to walk with their eyes lowered, a habit intended to cultivate humility, but which resulted in constant stubbed toes and bruised shins. You imagine heaven applauding the piety of bandaged ankles. Scholars still argue whether these homes genuinely helped women by offering shelter and skills, or whether they mainly functioned as instruments of control. enforcing middle-class ideals of purity upon the working poor. Some women used them as stepping stones, leaving to find respectable employment. Others found themselves trapped in cycles of entry, escape, and re-entry, their freedom whittled away by good intentions and tight rules. You step into the laundry of one such refuge. Steam clouds the air, sweat dampens collars, and the rhythm of irons slamming onto cloth sounds like artillery. A matron patrols, praising diligence and scolding any girl who hums a music hall tune. The gospel of work is recited as often as the Lord's Prayer. The logic is clear. Idleness breeds sin. Labor scrubs it away. Yet you notice that the matron's wages are paid while the girls are not. Just two. Apparently the true Christian lesson is that virtue thrives best on someone else's unpaid laundry. Not all stories here are grim. A seamstress recalls how a kindly patron paid her board for 6 months, giving her time to learn new skills. Another laughs quietly about sneaking novels into the dormitory, the forbidden pages shared like contraband sweets. Resistance finds small cracks. Scholars still argue whether such acts of defiance should be seen as survival tactics or tiny revolutions. Either way, they show that obedience was never total, even in the sternest halls. The workhouse chapel echoes with hymns. Children sing, their voices bright against the dull walls. They are orphans, illegitimate, or simply too poor for their families to keep. Here they learn discipline with their ABCs, a curriculum of both letters and morality. Some grow into apprenticeships and survive. Others carry the stigma like a shadow for life. Respectability once lost rarely returns clean. You pause at a ledger in the overseer's office. Names, ages, offences. Offences? You blink. Among the crimes listed are incontinent, idle, prostitute and destitute. To be poor is to be guilty. To be female and poor is to be doubly guilty. To have a child without marriage is to become a permanent footnote in shame's dictionary. The ink bites harder than any sermon. Outside, a group of reformers gather signatures to open yet another rescue home. Their intentions are mixed. Genuine compassion, social ambition, moral anxiety. They believe they are saving souls. The women inside often feel they are serving sentences. Just 3. You picture an advertisement for one of these homes. Come for the soup, stay for the surveillance. As dusk settles, you step away from the workhouse gates. Behind you, women sing softly in the laundry to lighten the steam. Children recite catechisms, and matrons count sheets like sins. Tonight has taught you that the Victorian way of handling fallen women was to fold them into institutions that blurred the line between charity and punishment. Rescue was offered with one hand and restraint with the other. You breathe the outside air, grateful to be free of boiled cabbage, and head toward your next stop, the mission halls, where reformers try to replace punishment with persuasion and piety with something resembling hope. You follow the street lamps into a quieter quarter where the noise of taverns fades and the air smells of coal mixed with hymn books. Here stand the mission halls, brick buildings without ornament, their doors open to anyone willing to step inside. Unlike the workhouse, which feeds with one hand and condemns with the other, the missions try persuasion. They promise a place where the weary might find bread, prayer, and the chance to begin again. Inside, benches creak under the weight of men and women who have wandered in from the alleys. A harmonium wheezes, accompanying a hymn sung with more heart than pitch. At the front, a reformer in a stiff collar delivers a talk about the prodigal son, weaving scripture with stern encouragement. You sit in the back pew, noticing that everyone listens with a mix of hope and suspicion. Tangible fact. Throughout the 19th century, evangelical missions spread across Britain's cities, offering soup, temperance pledges, sewing classes, and lodging in an effort to reclaim the poor and fallen. The women's mission halls often focus on those labelled at risk. They teach sewing, laundry, cooking skills that reformers believe can restore respectability and make women employable as servants or wives. The sewing rooms hum like hives, rows of needles flashing in rhythm. Quirky tidbit. Some halls even held industrial exhibitions to display the handiwork of their residents, a curious mix of charity fair and marketing stunt where middle-class donors could admire the improvement of their protégés while sipping tea. It is hard to say whether the stitching was meant to hold fabric together or stitch reputations back into society's patchwork. The mission is also theatre. Preachers tell dramatic stories of redemption. Mary, once lost to sin, now sings in the choir. Stories polished for newsletters that circulate among donors. You read one such leaflet and notice how the names are changed, the edges smoothed, the tragedy and triumph packaged neatly for public consumption. Scholars still argue whether these missions were primarily about helping the poor, or about reassuring the middle classes that poverty and vice were being managed. The truth likely sits between the benches. Lives changed in part, donors comforted entirely. You slip into a kitchen where soup bubbles in a great iron pot. A volunteer ladles portions to a line of women and children. The broth is thin but hot, a kind of edible welcome. On the wall, a chart displays temperance pledges signed with shaky hands. Those who take the pledge receive tokens for extra meals or lodging. The reformers believe sobriety is the first rung on the ladder out of sin. Yet you overhear two women whispering about a nearby gin shop, their laughter soft as they imagine slipping away after curfew. Just two. Apparently gin still does better marketing than soup, no matter how fiery the sermon. In a corner, a literacy class meets. A missionary teacher guides women through the alphabet, their fingers tracing chalk on slate. Some are embarrassed, others delighted. For them, literacy is more than skill. It is a new passport, a chance to read letters, contracts, or even novels. A young woman proudly sounds out the word home, and her neighbor claps. That moment feels more like redemption than any hymn. Tangible fact. Missions and philanthropic schools played a major role in adult literacy campaigns, part of a broader Victorian push toward education reform. The mission hall also doubles as a refuge. Women escaping violent husbands or pimps sometimes find shelter for a night. Though beds are few, rules abound. No swearing, no smoking, prayers mandatory. Scholars still debate whether such rules were genuinely protective or simply another form of moral control, echoing the rigidity of workhouses with a kinder face. Yet for some, the difference between a locked dormitory and a mission bed is the difference between despair and survival. You meet a reformer named Emma, sleeves rolled up, her Bible worn to threads. She speaks earnestly with a woman who has just arrived, her shawl frayed. Emma offers not only scripture but also names of possible employers. She believes salvation is practical, that dignity requires both prayer and a steady wage. Her eyes burn with conviction. You realize how much the missions depended on individuals like her. Stubborn, energetic, sometimes naive, but often genuinely compassionate. Without such volunteers, the halls would be empty shells. On the wall hangs a painting of the Good Shepherd, lamb in arms. You notice that the lamb looks oddly clean for something rescued from a thicket. The symbolism is clear. Women are lambs, reformers the shepherds. The metaphor comforts donors but irritates some residents who feel they are treated as children rather than adults with choices. Scholars still argue whether such infantilization did more harm than good, erasing agency in the name of care. Evening falls and the mission transforms into a gathering space. Lamps glow, benches fill, and a brass band strikes up hymns in the courtyard to lure passers-by. Crowds gather, some curious, others mocking. A few men shout crude jokes about rescuing them too, and the band plays louder to drown the heckles. Jest 3. One trombonist accidentally blares a wrong note, which makes the crowd laugh harder than the preacher's entire sermon. Sometimes humor, not holiness, wins the evening. As you step outside, you hear the band fade behind you, echoing through narrow streets. The mission hall stands as a paradox. Part sanctuary, part surveillance, part charity, part theater. It offers real help meals, literacy, occasional safety wrapped in layers of moral expectation. For some women, it is a stepping stone. For others, another institution telling them how to live. Tonight has taught you that Victorian rescue was rarely simple. It wore a smile, carried a Bible, and often left fingerprints of control on every hand it shook. The fog thickens as you walk on. Somewhere ahead lies not the mission hall but the marriage bed, where law and custom entwined desire with duty and intimacy itself becomes contested ground. You push open a bedroom door and the house exhales. The hallway's varnish smell fades into beeswax and linen. The quiet seasoned by the slow tick of a mantel clock. The bed is a carved citadel with a canopy like a ship's sail. Sheets folded with military precision, pillows stacked as if to barricade second thoughts. On the dresser, a prayer book lies beside a hairbrush. This is where respectability loosens its collar, then asks if doing so is proper. Inside these curtains, law, custom, and desire negotiate like diplomats who cannot decide whether to shake hands or draw maps. The marriage certificate, people call it the marriage lines, hangs in a frame. That paper does more than bless a romance. It folds two lives into one legal person. And for most of the century, that legal person is the husband. Coverture declares that a wife's property, earnings, and many rights merge into his, a principle that turns the wedding ring into a key that fits only one pocket. Reform arrives in cautious steps. Married Women's Property Acts in 1870 and 1882 begin to let wives keep what they earn, But in most bedrooms, the older script still whispers, duty, obedience, patience. Scholars still argue whether average couples embraced that script or treated it like wallpaper. Present, rarely discussed, quietly ignored when love was kind. You sit on the bed's edge and feel how custom turns intimacy into obligation. Clergymen's manuals speak of conjugal rights, a phrase so prim it squeaks. The idea is simple on paper. Marriage includes mutual sexual access and companionship. The legal version is thornier. If a spouse deserts, the other may sue for restitution of conjugal rights, asking a court to order cohabitation resumed. Tangible fact: such actions were common in 19th century England. They did not empower courts to force the act itself, but they could compel a spouse to return to the shared home, and ignoring the order risked attachment or property penalties. The petition's title sounds like lost furniture being reclaimed. Your Honor, please return the missing husband to the marital premises. Just one. You picture a bailiff carrying a spouse up the stairs like an especially grumpy wardrobe. The law trips over itself when husbands try private enforcement. One notorious case, R.V. Jackson in the early 1890s, ruled that a man may not imprison his wife to make her cohabit. He had locked her up after winning a restitution order. The judges freed her by habeas corpus and made it plain: conjugal rights are not a license to kidnap. That decision pushed back against the worst interpretation of marital power, though many other boundaries remained. Marital rape, for example, was not recognized as a crime in this era, sheltered by a centuries-old dictum that a wife's consent was presumed once and for all, a grim legal enchantment that would not be dispelled until the late 20th century. You feel the weight of that presumption settle on the quilt like cold fog. Custom supplies 1,000 small enforcers. A wife who declines too often risks being labeled frigid or sickly. A husband who stays away risks whispers about clubs, cards, and chorus girls. Advice books bustle in with recipes for harmony. Early to bed, moderate diet, open windows, a cheerful temperament. The euphemisms multiply until sentences look like lace. Pretty, full of holes, and not very warm. One best-selling manual suggests that marital intimacy is healthiest when governed by reason, not passion, and recommends intervals that sound suspiciously like a train timetable. Just 2. You imagine a couple comparing themselves to the 8:15 to Brighton. Reliable on weekdays, delays expected on Sundays. The furniture participates. Middle-class homes often boast separate bedrooms joined by a dressing room. The arrangement announces status. Space to spare and sometimes kindness. Snoring, infants and illness are easier with doors between. It also offers tactical distance. Visits between rooms become negotiations. Knocks as soft as confessions. Quirky tidbit. Some couples kept a bolster down the middle of a shared mattress, a cylindrical cushion that made the bed feel like a diplomatic frontier with neutral territory in the center. You picture midnight parley across the bolster with a candle guttering like a flag of truce. Scholars still argue whether separate rooms meant prudery, practical health, or simply the Victorian hunger for order in every sphere. Behind the lace, headaches bloom like wildflowers. The nervous headache becomes a household deity invoked at inconvenient times. Satirists write winks into comic papers. The gentleman with perfect health, except on his wife's night, the lady whose migraines ease on shopping days. Yet diaries complicate the joke. Many women are exhausted by pregnancy after pregnancy, by babies who cry in shifts, by corsets that insist ribs are optional, by work that never clocks out. Physicians prescribe spacing births for health, but contraception remains a coded marketplace of married people's friends and vague chemists' promises. Couples improvise quietly. Separate beds, calendar calculations, caution as choreography. The bedroom is also a courtroom without wigs. Some wives bargain. Money for coal, permission to visit a sister, a say in household decisions, in exchange for compliance with conjugal expectations. Some husbands, gentler than their sermons, learn to ask and not presume. Some marriages find a rhythm that feels like warmth, not duty. Class changes everything. Servants in attic rooms rarely get privacy or negotiation. The poor have thin walls, no time, and babies who arrive like unpaid bills. The law's grand phrases shrink when the mattress is stuffed with straw. You step to the window. Outside, the mission band's hymn drifts faintly through the night, while a music hall 2 streets over tosses back a bawdy chorus. Inside, the clock ticks judgmentally. A silver-handled hairbrush waits on the dresser, the bride's trousseau reduced to bristles, and a mirror that always tells the truth too literally. A husband removes his collar stud, which feels like unbuttoning half the nation's expectations. He wonders if tenderness can share a room with duty. She wonders if saying no will be heard as refusal or rebellion. Just 3. Somewhere in the house, a cat chooses this moment to refuse to leave the bed, which may be the only willful no likely to be respected. Legal reforms chip at the door. Magistrates can grant separation orders for aggravated assault. Desertion becomes firmer ground for divorce. Wives slowly gain property rights that make leaving imaginable. But the cultural math still favors staying. Churches scold, neighbors tally, mothers advise endurance. You trace a finger along the bedpost where the varnish has worn smooth and think about all the hands that have gripped it the same way. Evenings when patience felt like virtue, and others when it felt like erasure. What terrifies most in this room is not the act itself, but the arithmetic of power, the way law, economy, and reputation can turn intimacy from a gift into an invoice. The bedroom's silence keeps secrets better than any butler, yet tiny rebellions leave marks. A key moved to her pocket, a bolster placed with theatrical innocence, a visit refused with a headache that might be real, might be strategy, might be both. Scholars still argue whether such quiet tactics subverted the system or only made it survivable. Either way, they reveal the truth that polite manuals ignore. Consent cannot be legislated by furniture. Before you leave, you straighten the counterpane as if smoothing history's rumples. The room seems ordinary. Comb candle, folded nightgown, yet it houses the century's most contested treaty. Outside the door, the house resumes its polite noises. The banked fire, the distant carriage, the kettle beginning to talk to itself. You close the door softly. Behind it, duty and desire continue to bargain in whispers, and the law keeps its distance, except when it doesn't. You step into a chemist's shop, where blue bottles glow like quiet planets, and the bell over the door tinkles with more discretion than welcome. The counter smells of carbolic and peppermint. Behind glass, toothbrushes line up like choir boys, and behind those, a shadowed shelf holds the things no label dares to name. You remove your gloves, adopt the tone you learned in respectable parlors, and ask softly for a married people's friend. The assistant's eyelids do an elegant little nod. He reaches not for the display but for a drawer, slides out a parcel wrapped in brown paper, and lays it on the scale as if weighing propriety itself. When you untie the string later, you will find a packet of sheets thin as onion skin, faintly smelling of rubber and talc. Tangible fact. After vulcanization in the mid-19th century made rubber supple and durable, British and continental factories began turning out condoms, syringes and pessaries in quantities that would have startled your grandmother. What had once been hand-stitched animal membrane became rubber goods, cheap enough for some, still dear for many. In the chemist's lexicon, the word condom does not appear. The ads say married couples protectors, gentlemen's requisites, or simply hygienic appliances, as if a mop might be hiding inside. You browse the counter's other secrets. There are sponges on strings meant to be dampened and placed before the act, then rinsed like kitchen tools afterward. Powders of alum that promise to tighten virtue by chemistry. Syringes with elegant curves for a cleansing douche, their bulbs the color of unripe plums. Quirky tidbit. Some brands came with tiny tins decorated like perfume cases, so a woman's reticule might carry prevention disguised as scent. The tin's floral scrollwork saying violets, while the card inside murmurs timing. You roll one between your fingers and it thumps softly, a heartbeat of latex and hope. Not everyone has a chemist shilling to spare. In back rooms and boarding houses, couples rely on old customs. Withdrawal, learned by grim practice, longer intervals between visits across the bolster frontier, separate rooms when budgets allow. The sleep-inducing powers of a toddler with a spectacular lung capacity. A few try the safe days folklore that pretends the calendar is clockwork, though the clock often sulks and runs fast or slow. Douching with vinegar is touted in whispers. A lemon half appears in a story told by a friend of a friend, probably a century old but stubborn as rumor. Just one. Someone swears by a complicated method involving counting and the phases of the moon. You suspect the only thing it reliably prevents is spontaneity. You pick up a newspaper and see the coded advertisements lined like shy soldiers. For gentlemen, French articles of the highest quality. For married persons, only rubber nursery goods. Confidential parcels by post. The law is a shadow at your elbow. Books and pamphlets that explain too clearly may be seized as obscene. Courts define obscenity by imagining a vulnerable reader and asking what might corrupt them, a test so strict it will soon haunt printers and reformers alike. For now, the market blooms in the coded margin. The assistant murmurs that if you prefer French letters, there is a superior make with a neat ribbon tie. If you prefer English, a stout rubber will last longer but ask more patience. You nod sagely as if choosing umbrellas. You ask about failure. The assistant, who has practiced these lines the way a tenor practices scales, says that nothing is perfect, but caution improves odds. Sheaths sometimes split, sponges slip, powders disappoint. He recommends pairing devices like a good wine with cheese. You almost ask for a tasting flight and stop yourself in time. Jest 2. The instructions advise apply before excitement, which is a little like telling a sailor to reef before the wind, and while you are at it, do it with gloves on. A thin pamphlet leans against the register. Fruits of Philosophy, an American tract by a physician, attempts to explain anatomy and prevention in plain words. Tangible fact footnoted in the city's memory. In 1877, Annie Besant and Charles Bradlaugh republished that book in London, were tried for obscenity, briefly convicted, and then saw the conviction quashed on technical grounds. Sales exploded, and the debate birthed the Malthusian League, a movement arguing openly for voluntary family limitation. The chemist keeps only a few copies behind the counter. He sells them to customers who make it clear they can endure frankness without fainting. Scholars still argue whether the late-century fall in British birth rates owes more to contraception, a quiet revolution at the chemist's drawer, or to later marriage, immigration and the arithmetic of industrial life squeezing households into smaller rooms. Parish registers and family diaries offer clues, but not certainty. The numbers curve, the reasons tangle. You tuck the puzzle into your pocket with the brown paper parcel and think of the bedroom you left earlier, the bolster like a diplomatic border. Class, as always, edits the chapter. Middle-class couples can afford rubber goods and privacy. Working-class couples juggle cramped lodgings, irregular wages, and fewer shillings for sheets. Some employers sack maidservants who appear pregnant, so the fear of exposure steers choices as much as the fear of more mouths at the table. A discreet midwife whispers advice between delivering babies. A pressure group presses her ear to community rumor and learns which chemists ask no questions. The city runs like a quiet exchange market. Information in gossip, goods in parcels, dignity in the stubborn set of a jaw. You examine a novelty at the counter. Veil, a small rubber cap shaped like a poppy petal meant to be placed over the cervix. Its confidence exceeds its reliability, but its inventor talks like an engineer. The age loves a gadget. It wants a switch to flick. You remember the belts and bells that tried to police youth and shake your head at how the same rubber that tried to restrain desire now tries to civilize it. Either way, rubber sells. There is also the darker edge of the counter, the place where female pills make promises they should not. They are marketed as restorers of regularity, but everyone understands the implication. Some contain strong herbs, others a little more than sugar and hope. The chemist, careful, does not push them. He taps the safer parcel. Prevention, not remedy. And you hear 3 whole sermons sigh with relief. Just 3. He wraps the package so neatly that you suspect he could fold a scandal into a swan. You step back into the street with the parcel against your palm, its weight oddly reassuring. The fog smells of coal and bakery crust, a combination that says London is hungry and inventive. Somewhere a mission band warms up. Somewhere a music hall tests footlights. Somewhere a law clerk finishes a brief on obscenity. You carry tonight's lesson in your pocket. Respectability may preach duty, but households quietly practice strategy. Couples thread their way between sermons and shortages, bolsters and ledgers, hoping to share a bed without filling the cradle every year. In your mind, you draw a little map of the city's unspoken routes, from bedroom to chemist, from newspaper code to brown paper, from fear to planning. Intervention here is not a manifesto. It is a nightly choice, a whispered agreement, a nod across a dressing room threshold. Scholars still argue whether these choices are acts of liberation or simply a new form of household prudence. You decide they are both, depending on the night. As you walk, you fold the paper deeper into your coat. Lamps hiss, boots tap. A couple passes, hands brushing, speaking in the shorthand of people who have learned that love is not just a feeling but a calendar, a budget, a drawer key. The shop door closes behind you, the bell giving one last discreet note. Ahead waits a courtroom where those coded ads and pamphlets will be weighed like contraband ideas. You breathe the cold and follow the gaslit line toward print and judgment. You arrive at a magistrate's court where bundles of paper sit like nervous pigeons, all tied in brown string. A clerk unties one and fans out caricatures, pamphlets, and a thin book with the sort of title that pretends to be about botany while blushing about everything else. Police in bowler hats testify that the items were seized from a printer down Shoe Lane after a respectable informant reported sales to youths. Everyone in the room coughs at the word youths, as if grammar itself requires modesty. The judge clears his throat and sets the tone of a century with a single doctrine about pages and peril. Tangible fact. In 1868, the case of Regina versus Hicklin supplied Britain with the Hicklin test, which defined obscenity as any material that tends to deprave and corrupt those open to such influence, especially the impressionable. It allowed prosecutors to judge a book by its worst passage, to ignore authorial intent, and to imagine the youngest reader as the standard. You feel the walls close in on print like an overzealous bookbinder. If a sentence might lead a fragile mind astray, the whole volume could be burned. The clerk reads a paragraph aloud with all the emotion of a laundry list, yet cheeks redden on the benches. The judge asks whether children could see such words, whether servants might stumble upon them while dusting. The room nods vigorously. Just one. Someone mutters that under this logic the Bible itself would require a chaperone for certain chapters, then pretends he was only discussing agricultural metaphors. The test is not about literary merit. It is about imagined harm and imagined readers and the state's right to protect both. Outside the courtroom, Lord Campbell's earlier Obscene Publications Act of 1857 gives the police a broom. They may seize and destroy offending material with a magistrate's warrant. Printers and booksellers live with the constant risk that a shipment will vanish into a furnace. You picture a warehouse as a nervous lung, inhaling boxes in the morning and exhaling ashes at night. Your mind jumps back to the chemist's coded ads and brown paper parcels. Those packages move carefully because a statute hovers at their shoulder. Hicklin's reach proves elastic. It does not simply chase dirty pictures. It stretches into the territory of education and reform. Annie Besant and Charles Bradlaugh, whom you met at the chemist by way of their pamphlet on birth control, learned that a diagram can be judged as depraving if a magistrate imagines it in childish hands. Lecturers rehearsed their slides and then rehearsed their excuses. Books that discuss anatomy in plain terms must tiptoe through adjectives as if the floor were full of mousetraps. You visit a printer's shop at dawn. The compositor's fingers dance, setting type for a medical handbook that treats sexuality as biology. The foreman whispers that he will run the pages with clinical clarity, but will keep a lookout for words that could startle a policeman. He has 2 fonts for trouble, one respectable and one too candid, and he swaps them like a conjurer hiding cards. Scholars still argue whether such caution produced a stunted public conversation or whether readers found other routes. Private lectures, foreign editions, backroom libraries that diluted the law's chill. Quirky tidbit. The British Museum Library keeps a private case, a locked collection of erotica and restricted works requested by scholars with special permission and brisk manners. The catalogue does not list them publicly. A librarian produces them like contraband lawfully possessed. You imagine a reading room where coughs echo and ankles squeak on tiles and where a scholar receives a volume wrapped in discreet paper that says, "For research in the same tone a chef uses to say for stock only." The state does not deny curiosity. It merely corrals it behind brass rails and a frowning desk. Meanwhile, customs men exercise their own brand of morality at the docks. Foreign novels arrive, and translators learn to trim passages that might cause trouble. Henry Vizettilis' firm published Zola for English tastes and soon discovered the taste of prison porridge when prosecutors decided that realism looked too much like indecency. You hold one of the offending translations and notice how the blush is located not in the sentence but in the reader.
Just 2.
The prosecutor insists he has read every page very carefully, purely in the public interest. A level of diligence that would win medals if the medals were not made of melted printing type. Hicklin ripples into courtrooms far from London. Provincial magistrates adopt it with zeal. Others use it as a shield to wave off awkward prosecutions. One judge allows medical testimony to salvage a book, another refuses and orders the lot destroyed. The inconsistency becomes part of the terror. Writers begin to self-censor. Publishers develop lists of words that must be avoided or phrased in Latin that only doctors enjoy. Librarians slot sensitive books into closed stacks that require a letter from a gentleman of standing. The gatekeeping doubles as etiquette. If you can ask for the thing without blinking, you are old enough to read it. You stop at a station as where married people's friends used to be sold, too obviously. Now the proprietor keeps them in the cellar with the ledgers, and he has rehearsed a line about hygienic rubber goods for household use that would pass a bishop's inspection, provided the bishop is distracted by the window display. The law has not killed the market. It has changed its costume. You recognize the pattern by now. Anxiety writes a rule. Commerce reads it with a tailor's tape. Censors often claim to protect women and children. Women, meanwhile, lead campaigns that both resist and support the muzzle. Some reformers argue that certain novels glamorize vice and should be banned for everyone. Others insist that information about bodies and rights must be printed plainly, not hidden behind euphemism or Latin. Scholars still argue whether Hicklin was primarily about shielding youth, disciplining the working classes, or enshrining a middle-class sense of delicacy as national law. The answer may be yes to all three, depending on whose bench you sit on. You wander into a police court during a raid's aftermath. The seized cash includes French photographs, naughty songbooks, and a wax figurine whose artistry deserves a better fate than the inspector's glare. The magistrate orders the lot destroyed. The inspector promises to supervise personally, which you suspect is a job many men volunteer for with a somberness that masks curiosity. Just 3. As the parcel heads to the furnace, a constable asks if the fire risks moral smoke, and the clerk replies that only if the chimney reads French. The Hicklin test's most peculiar power is its scissor. By allowing the worst lines to condemn the whole, it trains critics to hunt for single sentences like truffle pigs. A novel's architecture becomes irrelevant if one room contains a lurid painting. Encyclopedias self-edit to avoid full descriptions of reproductive organs. Medical suppliers write like poets of fog, and poets learn to layer innuendo like pastry. You think again of the bolster on that bed and realize the same logic rules bedrooms and bookshelves. Partition, disguise, euphemize. In a coffee house, 2 young writers nurse cups of chicory and debate whether to press the envelope or change the envelope's address. One proposes publishing in Amsterdam and shipping discreetly. The other suggests constructing narratives where moral ruin follows swiftly after any frankness, thus satisfying the sensor's hunger for edification while smuggling in the scene. The plan smells of compromise and ink. Literature evolves a double tongue. One for the magistrate, one for the reader who can hear the whisper. Night folds in. The court locks its doors. The furnace cools. The bookseller reties his parcels. You tuck a newspaper under your arm and consider the strange arithmetic of the age. Obscenity is defined by the youngest eyes and the worst lines, and private case keys jingle in pockets that claim to despise their weight. The city chants that words can corrupt, yet sells songs that wink their way around any ban. You walk on, carrying the hush that follows a gavel strike, knowing the next rooms will return to bodies harmed, not by print, but by pathogens, and by cures that bite as hard as the disease. The lamps hiss like cautious librarians. Somewhere a compositor resets a page, swaps a word, and keeps the press running. You follow the clerk's directions to a doorway with frosted glass that reads Skin and Special Clinic, a euphemism that says everything and nothing. Inside, the benches are filled with men staring at their boots and women pretending to study the wallpaper. A bell dings, a nurse calls a number, and the smell of carbolic tries to scrub away a different odor. Fear dressed as respectability. You ease onto a bench and listen to the little coughs people make when they want to sound healthy. The doctor arrives, pocket watch glinting. He asks careful questions without ever using the worst words. The old names linger anyway. The pox, the French disease, clap, gleet. Nicknames that try to make calamity sound like a pub acquaintance. Tangible fact. For most of the 19th century, standard treatment for syphilis is mercury in one form or another. Blue pills, ointment rubs called inunction, fumigation boxes that sweat the medicine into the skin, often combined later with potassium iodide. For gonorrhea, urethral injections of silver nitrate or permanganate, joined doses of balsam of Copaiba and crushed cubeb pepper. Success is measured in disappearing sores and returning appetite, though relapses stalk recovery like persistent creditors. You watch a man nod bravely when told to report back weekly for inspection, as if the body were a ledger that must balance on command. You peek into the treatment room and find a contraption like a wardrobe built by a chemist. A patient sits inside, head poking out, while an assistant warms mercury over a lamp, letting the vapor drift through a pipe to bathe the body. The doctor calls it fumigation. The patient calls it a sauna with ambitions. Quirky tidbit. Some clinics insist the cure isn't working until the gums swell and saliva pours, tirelism as proof of dosage. So spittoons line the floor like brass mushrooms, and the room becomes a rhythm of cough, expectorate, hopeful sigh. Jest 1. You are told to spit frequently to hasten recovery, which sounds like the first medical advice ever written by a disgruntled parrot. Next door, the ointment room smells like mutton fat and metallic thunder. A dresser rubs grey paste into a man's thighs with quick, practiced hands, then swaddles him in flannel. The instructions are brisk: no spirits. Rest, avoid cold air. Abstain from excitement in every sense. The patient nods, eyes shiny with embarrassment and relief. In the corner, a woman in a plain bonnet asks quietly about her infant snuffles. The stuffy breathing that midwives whisper might be the mark of congenital infection. The doctor's face softens. Outcomes for babies are cruel, and the treatment's crueler still. He prescribes iodide drops and a regimen of hope. Outside, a patent medicine hawker offers a gentler promise. Private cure, no mercury. The paper rustles with euphemisms. Perfect manhood restored, secret weaknesses conquered, and testimonials signed a grateful sufferer of Leeds. You can smell the ink's dishonesty, but shame is a fast negotiator. Scholars still argue whether mercury did more good than harm across the century, or whether many cures were simply the disease's natural lulls dressed up as medical triumph. Statistics are fogged by lost records, secret treatments, and doctors who count improvement like a man counts favorable weather. Back inside, the gonorrhea room conducts its own orchestra. Glass syringes tap against bowls. A dresser draws up silver nitrate, the solution clear as a guilty conscience. Men shift on their chairs and stare at the ceiling while the nurse explains the importance of regular irrigation, a phrase that makes you think of gardens and immediately wish you hadn't. For home use, bottles of copper line the shelf. They do help some but leave a smell on the breath like furniture polish. Jest 2. A clerk whispers that the surest way to be discovered by your landlady is to burp near the umbrella stand. On another bench sits a soldier with a paper from the barracks medical officer. He will be confined to barracks and shamed by his mates until he tests clean. The double standard you met earlier stands here with folded arms. His partners bear the harsher stigma, are more likely to be blamed, examined, confined. He at least is offered treatment without needing to sell his coat. Across the aisle, a seamstress juggles appointments with work. Every missed day threatens rent. For the poor, the disease is only half the story. The calendar and the coin purse tell the rest. The doctor dictates instructions in a practiced monotone. Abstinence during treatment, clean linen, separate towels, no kissing infants if sores are present, return weekly even if you feel improved. He warns against quacks who promise swift cures and vanishing bills. Then, almost gently, he mentions that some people never fully clear the pox. It hides and returns years later to trouble bones, eyes, or mind. You think of the neurologic storms that come for a few in the long tail of the disease and are grateful for our century's quieter miracles, though they haven't arrived yet for these patients. Here the choices are crude. Poison the invader and hope the antidote doesn't become the story. On the wall, a poster from the Lock Hospital asks for donations. The London Lock, founded long before Victoria, still takes in the poorest cases, women especially, for months. Men sent when charities intercede. The asylum-attached teaches needlework between treatments, tying moral reform to medical care like two mismatched horses yoked to the same cart. Some residents recover and leave with references. Others vanish into the city again, their names entering the hospital ledger as numbers that do not explain what happened next. You browse the waiting room's literature. A pamphlet from the Social Purity Society scolds. Abstain before marriage, be faithful after. A rival pamphlet, discreetly folded, advises using sheaths, married people's protectors if restraint fails. The city itself cannot decide if it prefers sermons or rubber. Scholars still argue whether late Victorian declines in certain symptoms reflect genuine public health gains, better secrecy, or the way diagnosis shifted names as theories changed. When epilepsy absorbs hysteria and rheumatism swallows tail-end pains, the numbers dance. A young couple enters, eyes wide, hands clenched. They whisper that a small sore won't heal, that last month brought fevers and rashes. The doctor turns kinder than his mustache suggests. He explains primary, secondary, tertiary stages in simple language. He outlines a plan of rubs, goggles, and rest. He warns about mercury's bite, loose teeth, sore gums, night sweats. They nod. The woman asks whether marriage is ruined. He says, no, not ruined, but altered. He advises delay, treatment, candor. The room feels suddenly heavier than its benches. Cures multiply in the newspapers like pigeons after bread. Electric belts, German drops, doctor-specifics remedy, borrowing the name of a real French expert to sell very unreal certainty. They promise the moon at a shilling the dose. Jest 3. One bottle boasts invisible treatment, which you suspect refers to its active ingredients rather than its discreet shipping. People buy anyway because hope spends easier than shame. You step into the dispensary to watch powders measured. The pharmacist's hands are steady, the scale precise. He passes a small corked vial to each patient with instructions written in a clerk's tidy hand. The system is impersonal but not entirely unkind. In a corner, a nurse teaches a man to use the little glass syringe correctly, her voice patient, her gaze averted just enough to lend dignity. A basket of lemons sits on the counter, not as cure but as kindness. Sourness cuts metallic mouths and small mercies help people return. Outside, rain starts thin, insistent, the kind that polishes the city without cleaning it. You shelter under an awning and watch patients slip away separately, collars up, parcels tucked like secrets. Tonight has taught you that Victorian medicine fought venereal plagues with weapons as blunt as fear and as sharp as metal salts. Some treatments helped, some harmed, many did both. The stigma stung as hard as the syringe. Yet inside the clinic, you also felt a quiet professionalism groping towards science. Notes kept, outcomes tracked, superstition slowly losing ground to observation. You fold your coat tighter and step back into the street. Lamps sizzle, wheels hiss. Somewhere a music hall swells with a chorus about love, while in the clinic love is rewritten into doses and dates. Ahead waits a door with no sign, the kind spies prefer, where notebooks of addresses and coded initials record the city's desire in ledgers that can end livelihoods. You follow the wet shine of the pavement, thinking of Mercury's taste, of Cupaba's perfume, of baby's noisy breaths, and of how a secret becomes heavier each time it is folded. You slip through the unmarked door and into a room that smells like damp coats and ink. Shelves sag under black ledgers, each spine labeled in a clerk's tidy hand. A sergeant with a tobacco mustache taps one open. Inside, columns march. Address, initials, notes, sums. The handwriting is neat enough to look innocent. It is not. Here, the city's desire is translated into pen strokes, and a name in the wrong column can end a livelihood faster than any sermon. The sergeant explains the code as if reading a weather chart. An S means suspected. SE means confirmed. A small dot in the corner marks a tip from an informant who wants his shilling. Beside some addresses, there are tiny pencil crosses which you learn indicate a friendly landlord who prefers rent in cash and silence in bulk. The ledgers hold brothels, houses of accommodation, circulating libraries that sell more than Dickens under the counter, and chemists who stock risky pamphlets along with rubber goods. You feel the power stored in those pages, a storm bottled in calfskin. Tangible fact. In 1885, the National Vigilance Association formed in the blaze after the maiden tribute, Scandal, pledging to suppress the traffic in vice, prosecute under the new Criminal Law Amendment Act, and hunt indecent literature. They worked with sympathetic magistrates, hired watchers at railway stations, and sometimes brought private prosecutions when the police declined. Their office kept ledgers too, less official, just as feared. The sergeant is polite about these allies. His smile says cooperation on Tuesday, turf war on Thursday. You shadow two plainclothes constables as they prepare a sting on a bookseller who trades in risque photographs behind a rack of devotional cards. One produces a small purse of coins with tiny nicks filed into the rims. Quirky tidbit, marked money was standard practice for stings. The officer noted each coin's scar so the court could later hear how the very shilling tendered in purchase was recovered from the till. It is evidence with a manicure, just one. The constable says the coins are engraved for virtue, which is the most pious description of pocket change you have ever heard. You watch them rehearse the script that turns shopping into testimony. Ask for French postcards, never say naked, always say French. Accept whatever is offered, pay with the marked shilling, step aside so the partner can enter and make a second purchase. Then the sergeant arrives with a warrant folded like a holy writ, and the entire shop becomes an exhibit. You practice the neutral face that says you are buying a pencil, not watching a small tragedy spool out behind the counter. At dusk, the squad moves on a house off Leicester Square. The door carries no number, only a brass plate with a name that is not anyone's real name. A woman opens a slit, sees something she does not like in the hats outside, and tries to slam the bolt. Too late. The lock splinters, rooms bloom into chaos. One bedroom smells of violets and tobacco. Another has wallpaper that tries too hard to be Persian. A girl in peacock feathers stands very still, choosing invisibility as strategy. A man in his shirt sleeves reassures everyone that he is only here to discuss literature. Just two. He points at a volume of Tennyson with such conviction that you nearly applaud the performance. In the kitchen, a constable pokes a flour bin and fishes out a little book tied with string. It is a ledger of clients and fees, names reduced to 2 letters that say everything to the right pair of eyes. Addresses, days, sums. The madame protests gently that it is a housekeeping book. The sergeant reads a line that lists curtains mended 6pence and Mr. H, 2 hours, 3 shillings, and raises an eyebrow. The ledgers leave with the police, along with a shoebox of photographs wrapped in cheap tissue. A cat streaks under the table with a sardine and a look that says it recognizes no jurisdiction. Back at the station, the ledgers meet their cousins on the shelves. Cross-references are inked. The city's map grows denser. This is not only policing, it is geography. The constable from the bookseller case returns with his mark-chilling story ready for court and a string of pictures that will be described in euphemisms so thick the magistrate may never quite know what he has banned. Scholars still argue whether such raids reduced vice or merely relocated it, and whether the records served justice or invited extortion when corrupt officers discovered the financial uses of a reputation trapped on paper. You pay a call on the Society for the Suppression of Vice, older than Victoria, still vigorous in its newsletters. A secretary in a stiff collar describes the latest victory against a seller of indecent ballads. He shows you a drawer of decoy letters used to solicit suspect material, all written in a childish hand to satisfy the Hicklin logic about vulnerable readers. The letters look like theatre props. Their stage is a courtroom. You wonder how often these decoys create the very exchanges they exist to punish. The secretary does not share your wonder. On Saturday nights, lady patrols from a rescue society take up positions at railway termini. They scan the crowd for girls traveling alone with carpet bags and new ribbons. They offer tea, a bed, and a dress for a safe employer. Some girls accept gratefully. Others whirl off into the city with cousins, friends, and plans that require no chaperone. The patrols keep notebooks too, logging names, times, outcomes, and the occasional small triumph that will become a paragraph in the annual report. The line between care and surveillance stays thin as a thread. The same thinness lives in the music halls. Inspectors from local watch committees take seats in the back and note the lyrics that stretch propriety until it snaps with a laugh. They call managers to quiet rooms and warn them about fines if certain lines remain in the program. The managers nod soberly and ask whether an alternative double entendre would be acceptable. The inspectors pretend not to understand. Jest 3. An inspector claims he must attend 10 performances to be certain the offence is repeated, the longest act of reluctant research you have ever seen. You follow rumours to a quieter street where a private club occupies 2 floors above a tor. Its door has a bell that is never heard downstairs. The sergeant lays a gloved hand on your sleeve and says, "This one is not for tonight." He has learned that some doors open into scandals that float upward toward names with carriages and crests. He closes the ledger with a careful snap. There is prudence in the sound and politics. Later in the decade, a different address with messenger boys and gentlemen will become headlines. But for now, the ink stays put. You read the silence and understand that paper does not only accuse. It also protects. The informant system hums all the while. Landladies, cabmen, dressers in theatres, barmaids in gin palaces, even rival madams pass whispers for coins or favours. Some tell the truth, some settle scores, some think they are saving girls. The police grade their sources with tiny marginal marks. 1 cross means unreliable, 2 means valuable, 3 means indispensable and dangerous to know. A city like this runs on gossip converted into policy by men who own good pens. You return to the ledger room just before midnight. The sergeant writes a last entry, blows on the ink, and blots it with a square of wool felt rubbed soft. He locks the book into a cupboard along with seized photographs and the day's marked coins. Outside, hooves ring on wet stone. Inside, the clock ticks with the slow confidence of an institution that believes its records will outlast human complications. Scholars still argue whether these archives kept women safer, kept men more honest, or mostly kept a class system tidy by writing down the wrong people more often than the right. You step out into the lane. Raids scatter one house, and memories collect again 2 streets away. Spies fill notebooks, and then rumors erase them with new names. Ledgers promise order, and then deliver leverage to whoever holds the keys. You taste the night air and the metal of those marked coins, still cold even after so many warm pockets. Ahead, the city's doors keep closing and opening, and behind some of them there is neither commerce nor rescue but play, careful and deliberate, with rules entirely its own. You follow the lamps toward that quieter strangeness, where whips hang like stage props and consent rewrites the script that sermons tried to lock. You follow the constable's ledger into a neighborhood that keeps its secrets in upholstery. A footman you don't quite see opens a side door. The hall is dim, the carpet thick, the air warm with coal and orris. On a peg beside the umbrella stand hangs something that is not an umbrella. A braided switch wrapped in silk ribbon. A polite pretense for a not-so-polite hobby. The maid takes your cloak, as if none of this is remarkable. You are ushered into a parlor where the piano lid is down and the conversation runs in murmurs. The house rules are framed above the mantel in small type like a prayer book. Arrive masked if you wish, Behave, pay in advance, no marks where a collar cannot hide them, and if you want something to stop, tap the bedpost twice. The vocabulary is quiet. The boundaries clear. Sermons call this vice. The people in this room call it play. A hostess in a gown the color of strong tea offers tea, which is the kind of joke the English love. She explains the evening's plan as if arranging whist. Consent, she says, is an agreement with ears. Hear the yes, look for the no, and honor the tap. You notice a table of implements set out like a clothed orchestra. Riding crops, braided whips, a birch bound with ribbon, a paddle whose leather smells faintly of saddle soap. Just one. The hostess taps the paddle and says, "We favor the classical repertoire, no improvisational jazz." And the room smiles because boundaries are comfortable when the world outside is chaos. Tangible fact arrives with the clink of china. The birch and cane are not inventions of the underground. British public schools used them as standard tools of discipline deep into the 19th century. Novels like Tom Brown's School Days made the atmosphere famous and infamous, with canings performed under the banner of character building. The habit left a cultural imprint in private. Some alumni later sought the ritual without the humiliation, the sting without the shaming lecture, transforming punishment into choreography. Scholars still argue whether school discipline seeded a broader birch cult, or whether pornographers and gossip inflated a small taste into a national stereotype. You sip and think how often an institution's shadow becomes someone else's candle. You are shown a quieter room where the furnishings look like a tour's idea of a gymnasium. A high padded bench with stirrups that are definitely not for riding. A frame with straps that have seen careful oiling. A row of canes hanging by thickness like organ pipes. Quirky tidbit. An older member mentions the Berkeley horse, a notorious contraption devised earlier in the century by Teresa Berkeley, a London entrepreneur who fitted her wooden horse with pulleys and cords to raise or tilt the rider at will. The Victorians loved adjustable furniture. It made everything feel like engineering rather than appetite. A bell rings softly in the hall. Pairings begin. Some couples are married and have left the children with a nurse who believes they play whist every Thursday. Others are discreet strangers who signed a book with initials you suspect are not their own. Everyone knows the risks. Raids, blackmail, those ledgers you studied 2 streets ago. For that reason, the house keeps an exit through the mews, a jar of coins for emergency cab fare, and a paid arrangement with the cabman who asks no questions. Jest 2. The hostess swears the cabman is the soul of discretion and adds that he prefers his fares to be seated gingerly so as not to scuff his upholstery, which feels like a very specific request. The first sound you hear is not a crack but a breath. The rhythm that follows belongs to 2 people, not to the city's scolding. In one corner, a gentleman in his shirt sleeves kneels, offering his palms like a student at the piano, waiting for scales. In another, a woman, face calm, demonstrates the whispering swish of birch twigs over flannel. The emphasis is on ritual, position, count, pause, check-in. A hand rests on a shoulder to ask, to reassure, to remind. The tap, when used, stops everything. The room is a contract performed in small sounds. Printed matter circulates here like programs at a concert. There are slim volumes of verse that pretend to be ancient but were written last Tuesday. Songbooks with jokes tucked beneath hymn-like titles, and the kind of clandestine magazine you saw in the last district. The Pearl, for instance, a journal of fascia that flourished at the end of the 1870s with a startling number of birch-forward tales before the censors closed its covers. A gentleman quotes a line so purple the wallpaper blushes, then tucks the booklet away as the maid enters with more tea. The house is careful. Servants are paid well to forget. You drift into conversation with a woman who explains calmly that rules keep everyone safe. No intoxication, minimal marks, respectful forms of address, and the freedom to sit out whenever nerves ask for a chair. There is an ethic at work here, even a politeness. When the cane taps too eagerly, the hostess clears her throat and the tempo slows. You wonder if this quiet code is more honorable than many marriages where duty overrides listening. Scholars still argue whether such circles were marginal curios or secret saturations of respectable neighborhoods. The sources are partial. Police reports, salacious memoirs, and private letters that survived only by accident. Across the hall, a man in a domino mask chuckles that he joined because his doctor suggested a tonic, and this is the only tonic that helped. The room laughs softly. There is a medical thread winding through the century's kink. Physicians wrote case notes about flagellant mania with the same dry tone they used for sea bathing cures. Others recommended discipline for nervous temperaments, not understanding, or perhaps understanding too well, that the ritual relieved something sermons only tightened. Jest 3. Someone muses that if the Royal College of Physicians ever issued a tariff of approved thwacks, the prescriptions would finally be legible. Photographs are mentioned but rarely shown. You learn that certain studios produce cabinet cards where a model poses with a cane or arranged beside a birch, the pose halted before it becomes a scene, so the picture can pass as allegory if questioned. Artistic studies, the backstamp says, and everyone agrees that art can be terribly helpful when explaining things to a magistrate. The hostess forbids cameras in the house. Images get people into ledgers, and ledgers end evenings forever. You feel shadows stretch under the door. Etiquette extends even to the tools. Canes are warm near the fire to stay supple. Birches are soaked and bound fresh. Implements are wiped, numbered, and returned to their pegs like library books. Newcomers are taught to start light and count slowly, to check the color of skin the way cooks check caramel, to stop before bravado turns to bruise. The metaphors are domestic and culinary because that is where the participants live the rest of the week, in kitchens and parlors with kettles and pastry and the long polite distances of dinner parties. Here they make a shorter distance and a clearer agreement. Not everyone who knocks finds what they want. Some expect humiliation and find gentleness. Some expect savagery and find jokes about upholstery. Some bring snobbery, believing money entitles them to more than the rules allow. They are shown the door by a butler who could end a duel with a raised eyebrow. The club's ledger keeps but 3 notes: fee paid, time begun, time ended. Names are initials, no addresses, no gossip. The house survives by forgetting. You ask the hostess whether sermons ever make her nervous. She smiles at the word nervous as if it belonged to the doctor's vocabulary, not hers. She says morality is a stage. The city loves a show. 1 month the theatre sells temperance, the next it sells scandal, and both do brisk business. What she sells is arrangement. People bring fear. She provides rules. The fear quiets. The rules persist. It is not a theology. It is logistics for the unruly human heart. When you leave, the night feels cooler than it did an hour ago. The door closes without a latcher's complaint. You pass a stationer's window where birch rods are displayed as if they were purely for schoolrooms, which is perhaps not entirely untrue. Somewhere a prefect at a boarding school intones the benefits of discipline. Somewhere a printer arranges a story for a journal that will be seized next week. Your steps echo, and a cab rolls by, the driver glancing once and then away. The city contains multitudes and keeps most of them indoors after midnight. You pocket tonight's lesson with care. Even where the century hammered hardest about virtue, underground rooms refined a different ethic. Consent negotiated, roles chosen, risks managed, secrecy shared. The terror for those who disapprove is not the sting of the birch, but the possibility that private agreements can exist without permission from pulpit or parliament. You follow the lamps toward a different door, where secrecy takes on a new form. Studios lit by skylight, cameras on tripods, and cabinet cards passed from pocket to pocket with an innocent stamp on the back in neat copperplate. You climb a narrow stair to a studio where daylight spills through a north-facing skylight, soft as milk. A camera stands like a brass telescope on a wooden tripod. Velvet backdrops droop in folds that pretend to be drapery from a Roman villa. The photographer greets you with a bow and an offer that sounds perfectly respectable. Carte de visite cabinet or art studies. His mustache is waxed into confidence. His assistant dusts a velvet chair with a whisk that has seen a century of powdered faces. You feel the ritual of portraiture wrap around you like a shawl. Sit still, look mild, pretend time is not passing. Tangible fact. Beginning in the 1850s, the carte de visite, a small album print on card, made famous by the multipallins method of a Frenchman named Disteri, became a craze. People collected celebrity carts like stamps and pasted them into albums. Actors, bishops, generals, even pets. By the 1860s and 70s, the larger cabinet card ruled mantelpieces, the calling card of the camera. Studios multiplied, prices fell, and the nation learned to hold its breath for 8 seconds without blinking. Just one. The photographer says, "Try not to breathe," and you comply so earnestly that your soul considers filing a complaint. The respectable studio has a back room where the euphemism art studies hangs like a bead curtain. Nothing illegal here, the proprietor assures. Only classical poses useful to painters. Venus with strategically arranged drapery, Psyche contemplating something safely off-frame. For artists, he repeats, as if the word were a fig leaf with a receipt. He shows you a portfolio stamped Academy Studies in gold. The prints are carefully composed. A column here, a lyre there, a veil that clearly had a meeting with gravity. The models stand very, very still. Wet collodion does not forgive fidgets. You admire the lengths people will go to make 19 seconds seem like marble. He keeps another case for special clients. Inside are cabinet cards that tiptoe across the Hicklen line like tightrope walkers. Stockings drawn on with a retoucher's pencil. A nipple transformed into a shadow by a pin-sized drop of gouache. Quirky tidbit. Some studios employed an in-house retoucher whose job was essentially fig leaf logistics, painting modesty onto glass negatives so the resulting prints could survive a visit from a polite policeman. The work demanded a steady hand and nerves of cream. One slip and the fig leaf becomes a cabbage. Not all of the trade is domestic. Many cards arrive in parcels from Paris, wrapped in newspaper that smells like chicory and scandal. Dealers call them French postcards, the word French doing all the heavy lifting. A stationer near Charing Cross carries scenic stereographs of the Alps in his window and a small box under the counter where the views are of other peaks entirely. You lift a stereoscope to your eyes and the world pops into depth. 2 photographs become one scene you could step into if your morals were more athletic. Just 2. The stereoscope is Victorian virtual reality, except you never trip over furniture because everyone is too proper to run. The distribution network is a waltz of discretion. Kiosks at stations sell albums with spaces for carts of princes and actresses. A clerk quietly slides a second album across the counter, with blank pockets and a heavier price. Mail order thrives under codes you now recognize from the chemist. Continental art studies by post, confidential. Some bundles nestle the risque between respectable landscapes, a photographic sandwich that lets the postman believe you are an unusually devoted fan of mountains. The censors catch a few. Many slip through. The city deals in brown paper the way bankers deal in ledgers. Policing remains tangled. The Obscene Publications Act gives magistrates the power to seize, and the Hicklen test lets them judge a book by its baddest line. Photographs are easier to condemn because they refuse euphemism. The photographer explains his choreography when raids seem likely. I keep the Academy folio near the door, the oddities near the coal scuttle, and a broom ready for stagecraft. He winks. You imagine prints disappearing into ash moments before a constable knocks. Scholars still argue whether the trade was vast, as reformers claimed, or relatively small, as embarrassed archives imply. The evidence is a suitcase full of contradictions owned by a man who refuses to unlock it in public. You pass into the darkroom where glass plates lean like a library of ghosts. The air smells of ether, hypo, and boiled patience. The assistant dips a plate and counts, lips moving. Portraiture is a domestic miracle. Light writes on silver. Time calls itself truth. The same process that gives grandmothers their best angle also records bodies the law says must not be seen. You think of ledgers and rules and understand why this room feels both brave and precarious. Memory is becoming mechanical. Secrets can be reprinted. The public version of this appetite wears a stage costume and calls itself Poses Plastiques, living statues arranged on platforms at some theatres, where motionless bodies dressed as Greek myths could be admired by audiences who insisted they were there for art. The Lord Chamberlain polices dances and lines, yet a statue is not a dance, and a tableau is not a scene, so the law squints and shrugs. Sensational weeklies review the tableau with the vocabulary of sculpture and the schedule of sailors on leave. You consider how many loopholes are simply windows with good curtains. Albums in middle-class parlours tell twin stories. The front pages glow with carts of family members arranged by age and ambition. Turn a few leaves and celebrity faces appear. A gallery of actresses with perfect profiles. At the back, sometimes tucked into a pocket made by tearing the cloth hinge, there are cards that only come out after toddy. The album is a machine for conversation. It is also a box with a secret drawer. You flip it shut, and the parlour resumes its halo. Not all images flutter on the same breeze of desire. Ethnographic photographs arrive from Empire labelled types, pretending to be pure science while staging bodies for viewers in London who interpret them through fantasies and fear. Explorers send back albums of native beauties that sit curiously beside pictures of glaciers. The labels speak a language of measurement, the gaze speaks another. You can feel eugenics waiting in the wings, its map pins pricking. Technology shifts the market's gears. By the 1880s, dry plates simplified shooting. Cameras became easier to carry. The number of studios rose, but so did the number of amateurs. A gentleman with a club membership could develop his own glass and make his own studies, which made him both bolder and harder to police. Later, when photogravure migrated into periodicals at the century's end, images walked into newspapers without the bottleneck of engravers, moralists grew nervous. The retoucher ordered more gouache. You talk with a model who prefers to be called an artist's assistant. She poses under a pseudonym borrowed from a Greek myth and insists on tea breaks and payment in advance. She works for painters in daylight and for photographers on slower afternoons when the clouds behave. She describes a whole economy of respectability maintenance. Cloaks for the walk home, a clean chemise on a string under the drapery, a landlady who accepts that the rent comes from studio work and chooses not to ask which studio. Her rules sound familiar again. Consent, boundaries, exit routes. The city teaches the same vocabulary in different rooms. A customer enters and asks for an album of Italian statuary. The photographer produces a box with marble nudes, all tasteful, all chilled by the camera's slow eye. The customer coughs and murmurs that he hoped for something more instructive. The photographer replaces one box with another whose lid fits a shade too snugly. The man buys, pays with coins that do not bear filed marks today, and leaves by the stairs that creak second-floor gossip, just 3. The photographer writes the sale in a ledger as 2 columns and a liar, which is technically true and spiritually evasive. Out in the street, a boy hawks stereographs of Niagara Falls, while his older brother sells cabinet cards of generals. An omnibus rattles by with a poster for a tableau show for families, which is a phrase doing heroic labor. Somewhere a magistrate prepares a warrant for a shop that will be empty by dawn. Somewhere a painter copies a photograph and calls it antique virtue. Somewhere a parlor hosts a viewing party where the last 3 cards stay pocketed. You angle your face to the skylight for one more look at the studio and realize what terrifies polite society is not only the skin on paper, it is the democratizing memory of the camera. Desire used to be a rumor. Now it can be filed, it can be pasted, it can be mailed with a stamp and a prayer. The postman is sleepy. Photography multiplies selves and secrets in equal measure. The same album hugs a wedding portrait and a classical study. The same glass plate can be an heirloom or an exhibit. As you descend the stairs, the light thins and the prints cool. The doorbell tinks. The street swallows you. Ahead waits a reading room full of maps and measurements where fantasies dress up as science and the empire learns to sell its daydreams back to itself. You step from the skylight studio into a reading room that smells of leather bindings and ambition. Globes tilt like ripe fruit. Maps sprawl across tables, coastlines stippled with harbors that the empire calls its own. On one shelf sit calipers, measuring tapes, a brass goniometer for skull angles, and a set of color charts for hair and eyes. The clerk says these are for science, and you nod, aware that in this room science sometimes moonlights as wishful thinking with instruments. A gentleman in a frock coat balances a cranium on his palm like Hamlet, with a prop borrowed from an anatomy theatre, then scriggles down a number meant to describe a life. Tangible fact. London's learned societies, ethnological, founded earlier, and anthropological 1863, later merged as the Anthropological Institute 1871, published journals on types of mankind, hosted lectures on skin, skull, and civilization, and traded measurements the way bankers trade figures. Across the Channel, Paul Broca forged craniometers and color scales in Paris. In Britain, Francis Galton counted noses and heights, coined eugenics in 1883, and set up an anthropometric laboratory at the 1884 International Health Exhibition, later at South Kensington, inviting the public to be measured as if improvement were a ticketed attraction. You feel the tape slide around your head and hear the soft hiss of numbers becoming destiny. A man with a captain's beard reads aloud from a travelogue, his voice full of confident italics. He praises the noble savage, then warns about savage passions, doing a 2-step between admiration and anxiety that could use better choreography. The book's engraving stage women from India, Polynesia, and Africa as picturesque types. Breasts draped just enough to pass a drawing room test. Eyes fixed on a horizon defined by the author's pen. The captions use the grammar of biology. The gaze uses the vocabulary of fantasy. Just one. The traveler says he kept a strictly scientific distance, which sounds like a measurement you can only take with a ruler and a very selective memory. Post arrives with parcels of photographs from Bombay, Cairo, and the Cape. The prints are labeled ethnographic, posed with spears, baskets, and carefully neutral backgrounds. Some are commissioned by museums. Others feed commercial albums titled Peoples of the Empire, a phrase that claims a family portrait and forgets to ask permission. You recognize the camera's cool accuracy from the studio upstairs and feel how easily accuracy can serve an agenda. The plates capture bodies without names, then slot them into cabinets like butterflies pinned to mahogany. On a bulletin board hangs a poster for the Colonial and Indian Exhibition of 1886, held in South Kensington, its Indian court drawn like a fantasy bazaar. The caption promises artisans at work, native manufacturers, and the riches of distant provinces brought to the metropole for polite inspection. You walk the exhibition halls in your mind. carved teak, spices, looms, men and women demonstrating crafts for crowds who murmur at the colors and buy souvenir albums to remember the sensation of mastering the faraway by strolling past it. Scholars still argue whether such living displays educated visitors about skilled labor or turned people into set dressing for imperial pride. The truth, like the lacquer on those cabinets, shines and obscures at once. Down the shelf sits a skull labeled with a name and a place, the name foreign enough to be reduced to a syllable. A pamphlet explains a theory. Brain volume predicts worth, angles decide character, foreheads forecast futures. You remember the phrenology parlors that issued charts for a shilling, telling clients their amativeness and firmness as if a scalp could speak in bar graphs. Quirky tidbit. Some Victorian employers reportedly consulted phrenologists when hiring servants, seeking docility by bump map, human resources with calipers and a very confident eyebrow. The respectable learned societies sniff at such parlors, even as they share an appetite for measurement that outruns humility. Another table displays composite photographs, Galton's eerie overlays meant to reveal the average face of a group, criminals, consumptives, the urban poor. He argues the blur shows a type. Critics suspect the blur shows the method. You tilt the image until it becomes a ghost of statistics. Jest 2. Someone says the composite of the British public would be a slightly bored man, holding an umbrella, and you concede the science may finally have found its match. The room's reading list indulges older fantasies too. An Orientalist volume rhapsodizes about harem rooms it never entered, turning domestic spaces into erotic postcards by paragraph. Another publishes sketches of Nautch girls as if Indian dancers existed solely to drape British adjectives in silk. Missionary reports swing the other way, describing fallen women abroad with the same sorrowing tone used in London slums, their rescue plans echoing the mission halls you visited, now scaled up to continents. Scholars still argue whether the Victorian reader believed these printed fantasies or treated them as travel theatre. Circulation figures hint at sincerity, marginalia suggests skepticism, bank accounts show publishers delighted either way. A case at the back holds minstrel show playbills, imported blackface troupes that crowded London stages, proof that popular entertainment learned to sell caricature as comfort food. The laughter helps audiences digest policies they don't want to name. A pamphlet about miscegenation lies nearby, its cover warning that mixed marriages ruin nations, its arithmetic of panic written in italics. The empire announces itself as family but polices its kinship like a fussy genealogist who dislikes unexpected branches. You leaf through medical reports from colonial outposts. The Contagious Diseases Acts that scandalized garrison towns at home had harsher twins overseas, with forced examinations of colonized women justified as protecting imperial soldiers. Racism and fear of disease braided together. A speculum becomes an instrument of control as much as of diagnosis. A military surgeon describes tropical bodies as if climate carved morality, and you hear breath through the palm leaves. Jest 3. One report advises officers to avoid native liquors and native liaison, a sentence that suggests the author's strongest instrument was his thesaurus. Back in the metropolis, museums arrange ethnographic courts of artifacts, grouping spears beside masks beside textiles, while labels hum with dates and tribes. It looks like learning, and sometimes it is. It also teaches a subtle lesson, that cultures can be laid out on tables for comparison, ranked by tools, marched towards civilization like a syllabus. Children press noses to glass. Adults congratulate themselves on being the end point of someone else's timeline. The telegraph clicks, a railway schedule arrives. Progress feels measurable, therefore moral. A lecturer at the Royal Geographical Society points with a stick at a map full of blankness he calls unexplored, ignoring the millions who live in the so-called white spaces. He speaks of penetration and opening up, verbs that fold conquest into grammar. You imagine the stick as a wand that erases inconvenient inhabitants with a tap. Afterward, gentlemen applaud, sip sherry, and recommend a tailor for tropical suits. Outside, carts rattle with crates stamped Couttois Lahore and Goswell Road, a rhythm section for the Empire's melody of confidence. At a smaller meeting across town, a critic rises to say the obvious heresy, that skulls are poor storytellers, that type photographs flatten people into props, that the Empire's science smells faintly of theatre grease. His paper earns tight smiles and looser footnotes. In a terroum, a woman scholar mutters that measuring heads is easier than measuring justice, and that is why calipers get funding. You watch her cup tremble slightly and recognize a familiar courage, the kind that speaks softly and waits 20 years to be heard. The camera you left keeps working in this room. Ethnographic nudes circulate as studies for artists. Missionaries send before and after portraits of converts in new clothes. Anthropologists file frontal and profile shots on card after card. Memory multiplies. Bias does too. Albums travel home with civil servants. Each picture a story about order, difference, desire. Some families place them in parlors next to wedding portraits. Domesticated empire arranged beside domestic bliss. The album closes with a crack like a polite border. By late afternoon, the reading room glows like varnished certainty. You set the calipers down and feel how the empire exported fantasies and imported them back as facts. The harem room the writer imagined, the type the photographer staged, the average face the statistician blended, the exhibition that sold closeness to what it kept distant. Scholars still argue whether the pseudosciences led policy or merely laundered it, offering a lab coat to choices already made by merchants and ministers. Either way, the instruments made the fictions look measured. You return the travelogue to its shelf and touch the ridged leather of a map case. Outside, the street smells of rain and coal again, stubbornly local. A boy runs past with a kite shaped like a ship, tugging against its string as if it wants to colonize a cloud. You smile and let the joke land quietly. The lamps begin to hiss. Ahead waits a softer room where public rules harden into private laws and love, queer, careful, coded, learns to survive a clause that can turn a whisper into a crime with a name so vague it fits any door it wants. You turn down Gerrard Street, where the windows are full of gloves, scent, and complacent mirrors, and the night fills with a softer grammar. Men walk 2 by 2 with a fraction more space between their shoulders than friendship strictly requires. A door opens to a Turkish bath. Steam drifts out, opaline and forgiving. Inside, gentlemen murmur about rowing clubs and Greek statuary the way other men murmur about horses. No one says what the conversation is really about. You listen for the pauses, the deliberately casual glances, the theatre of after you. No after you at the staircase that leads to cooler rooms and more dangerous air. Just one. The steam does everyone a favor by fogging mustaches and intentions equally, which is the closest thing to plausible deniability London ever invented. Codes help. A violet in a buttonhole on the wrong day. An overly appreciative remark about a statue's calves. A book of Plato carried face up on a bench, open to the pages where love between men is treated as philosophy rather than scandal. In the music halls, male impersonators like Vesta Tilly swagger across the stage in evening dress, and a small subset of the audience reads more than comedy in the performance. In clubs and studios, the word Uranian circulates among readers who prefer their feelings in Greek. Quirky tidbit. For a season in the 80s, a green carnation in the lapel became a teasing fashion wink thanks to a satirical novel, more than any secret society, so ambiguous that it is either code or couture depending on who's watching. Life is careful. Letters are filed under false names. Close friendships slip into a category society calls romantic friendship, which is tolerated as long as sentences end in friend and never in verbs. Women's friendships fit this silhouette even more easily. 2 ladies sharing rooms in a household are praised for economy and constancy. Their affection tucked under a shawl labeled sisterhood. Tangible fact. English law did not criminalize sex between women in the 19th century. Debates centuries later will mythologize a thwarted attempt to add it. But in Victoria's reign, the statute book aimed its thunder at men, not because women were accepted, but because their desires were politely ignored by a culture that preferred not to name them. Scholars still argue whether that silence sheltered women or erased them so thoroughly that many could not even imagine their love as a possibility. The men are not sheltered. At mid-century, prosecutions for sodomy, buggery in the older legal language, still occur, though proof demands intrusion and witnesses. Then 1885 arrives, and with it a sentence slipped into a long reform bill at a late hour. A clause introduced by Henry Leboucher that criminalizes any act of gross indecency between males, public or private. The words are a net with holes of the drafter's choosing. Tangible fact of the Criminal Law Amendment Act, soon nicknamed the Leboucher Clause, turned act short of sodomy into crimes, lowered the evidentiary bar, and made privacy irrelevant. It will be the instrument used a decade later to prosecute Oscar Wilde. You feel the city stiffen, as if someone has tightened a belt around its lungs. Scholars still argue whether Leboucher aimed chiefly at male brothels exposed in scandals, or knowingly wrote a deliberately vague weapon that could be aimed anywhere at anyone. You pass the very alley you were warned about 2 sections ago, where messenger boys once slipped in and out of a discreet house, brass numbers bright on their caps. The Cleveland street scandal of 1889 breaks there. Telegraph lads, a set of well-placed clients, whispers that swell into headlines. The police move cautiously when the names grow too grand to write in ink. Careers end anyway, and a vocabulary of filth and panic migrates from the broadsheets to the breakfast tables. Some men flee abroad ahead of the newsprint. Others endure a silence that sounds like polite dinner conversation. The law's genius is its vagueness. Gross indecency can be a gesture, a letter, a line from a diary, a meeting in a park that never made it to a room. Blackmailers learn the clause by heart. Critics will call it a blackmailer's charter, a statute that empowers any cornered acquaintance with a pen and a nerve. Police set watches at public urinals and on park paths. Constables rehearse how to swear that a touch meant intent. Turkish baths become riskier. So do clubs. So do glances. The city's old choreography goes on, but the tempo slows and the steps shrink. Courtrooms become theatres of humiliation. In 1870, years before the clause, Fanny and Stella, two Londoners who lived and performed in women's dress, were hauled before a magistrate, still painted from the previous night's stage, theatrically displayed to scandalize the gallery, before a jury ultimately acquitted them of the worst charges. After 1885, the theatre returns with a new script. In 1895, Wilde sued the Marquess of Queensberry for libel, lost and stood trial himself under the Labouchere clause. The prosecution recited hotel registers and moral arithmetic, while the audience on the benches pretended to be shocked and new. He was convicted and sentenced to 2 years' hard labour. Just 2. A wag mutters outside that the nation has defended its morals by imprisoning its wit, which seems like taking a hammer to a clock for telling the wrong hour. Medical men take their own notes. The decade fills with case histories and taxonomies. Inverts, Uranians, contrasexuals, the labels multiplying like cabinet drawers. Havelock Ellis will soon publish Sexual Inversion, first abroad to dodge the magistrate's red pencil, arguing it is neither sin nor crime nor disease but variation. He uses testimonies and biographies rather than thunder. The book will find itself dragged into court anyway. You stand in a library where these volumes sit behind a desk, and the librarian issues them with the same caution he uses for books on dynamite. Scholars still argue whether the medicalization of queer lives softened the blow of criminalization or simply replaced the judge with a doctor's chart. Meanwhile, the world keeps making room where it can. In the arts, intense friendships decorate poems with Greek quotations and Roman coins. Edward Carpenter leaves London for a simple life in the north. Sandals, socialism, and a partnership he refuses to apologize for. Friends visit and find a different kind of respectability, vegetables, books, and honest affection. In the theatre, double entendres are tuned like instruments only certain ears can hear. In letters, dear friend does the labor of 3 unsentenced paragraphs. In parks, certain statues become rendezvous points because marble never testifies. Domestic life invents its own shelters. 2 women keep a house together and host Friday teas until the neighbors can no longer imagine them apart. Friends call it a marriage in whispers and bring jam. 2 men marvel at how much can be said about Persian rugs without ever mentioning why it matters that the sofa be comfortable for reading. Jest 3. One hostess instructs a maid that if a caller asks whether Mr. X is at home, the correct response is he is indisposed, meaning he is very happily posed on the sofa with a novel and must not be disposed at all. Then there is the terror you cannot tear away. Prison, hard labor, wrecks bodies used to desks and studios. Silence gags. Letters are censored into skeletons of their former meaning. Men come out older, poorer, adrift. Some emigrate, trading English parks for continental cafes where the police ask fewer questions until a bad week comes and they ask more. Some marry women to survive within the script, a solution that arrives with its own ache. Some thrive in circles held together by art and loyalty, mapping routes through a city that teaches them to be cartographers of their own safety. The evening draws to a close. A constable coughs in the shadow of a cast-iron urinal. Somewhere a judge lifts his pen to underline the word gross with relish. Somewhere else, in a small room above a stationer's, 2 friends lean toward each other, foreheads nearly touching. As a line of Sappho or Shakespeare stands guard on the mantel like a talisman, you think of all the codes you have learned on this walk. Bells on nightshirts, bolsters on beds, brown paper at chemists, and realize this code is the most human. The choreography of finding each other without being found out. You close a door gently behind you and stand with your palm on the panel until your breath slows. The Labouchere clause has made the private room porous. It has turned affection into evidence and friendship into risk. Yet in the same breath you have seen how resourceful love can be, how it borrows literature and fashion, steam and silence, to build shelter where statutes try to strip it away. The lamps on Gerrard Street hiss like cautious confidants. You step back into the fog, carrying the after-image of a green carnation and a stack of letters tied in ribbon. And you follow the quietest current toward rooms where desire is turned into doctrine, diet, purity, seances, and the promise that abstaining from the body might finally calm the mind. You follow the fog into a hall lit by oil lamps and conviction. Folding chairs scrape. Someone tunes a harmonium that has opinions. On the wall, a hand-lettered placard promises 3 things most Victorians crave: health, purity, and peace of mind. Tonight's menu is a sampler, a spiritualist séance, a lecture on the water cure, and a temperance pledge table set up like a recruiting desk for virtue. You settle near the aisle, ready to slip between worlds as easily as the speaker slips between subjects. The séance comes first. A medium with serious bangs and a softer voice asks everyone to link hands. The room breathes together. Table legs tremble. A bell tinkles in a corner no one is sitting in. A widow murmurs her son's name and the air goes thin as thread. Tangible fact. Spiritualism crossed the Atlantic in the 1850s, Fox sisters in New York, then celebrated mediums like Dee Dee. Home in London, parlours mingling grief with spectacle until even serious men attended table rapping as if it were experimental philosophy with candles. Here desire wears mourning clothes. The promise is not pleasure but consolation, a love that refuses to stop at the grave's edge. When the lights brighten, the medium sells tickets for private sittings and hands out a pamphlet on magnetic hygiene. Avoid stimulants, sleep with windows open, restrain the passions to keep one's aura polished. You recognize the era's favorite equation. Sex equals vitality, spend one to lose the other. A gentleman whispers that he is going to conserve his magnetism. You suspect his wife is going to conserve her patience. Just one. If magnetism truly leaked the way pamphlets claim, London should be sticking to the ceiling. A hydropath strides to the lectern next, coat smelling faintly of eucalyptus and certainty. Water, he says, is the divine physician. Wet sheets, cold douches, sitz baths at sunrise, and a bracing walk to Malvern. Tangible fact. Hydropathy, popularized by Vincent Priesnitz on the continent, bloomed in Britain at centres like Malvern, where doctors such as James Manby Gully prescribed wraps, diets, and walks to patients exhausted by city life. The pitch is as much moral as medical. Clean water, clean habits, clean thoughts. You can hear old panic echoing. If the body is a leaky system, the cure is faucets with locks. Between talks, a table near the door sells brown bread and pamphlets. A banner reads The Vegetarian Society, founded 1847, the man says proudly. He offers pies built with nuts and duty and explains that meat heats the blood and inflames desire. Vegetables calm it. You nibble a slice that tastes like the honest effort of a field. Scholars still argue whether Victorian vegetarianism and dress reform were mostly health experiments, ethical projects, or quiet strategies to dial down sex in households without saying the word. The truth likely sits in your mouth, part principle, part prudence, part fashion. A woman in rational dress demonstrates a cycling outfit with bloomers and a jacket that invites oxygen to attend. She argues that tight lacing strangles organs and patients alike, that a freer body means a freer, and she blushes and presses on. Comfort aids continence because misery goes to get impulse. Quirky tidbit. The Rational Dress Society really did distribute pamphlets and patterns in the 1880s, cheerfully measuring corset inches like a tailor for liberty. The audience applauds. You notice 2 matrons calculating whether a looser bodice can negotiate with a mother-in-law. Toward the back, a table of purity campaigners collect signatures for temperance and celibacy pledges. The language is careful. Abstinence before marriage, self-control within it, a formula stitched into hymns and lesson books. A young man asks about nocturnal thoughts. The leader recommends cold baths and early rising. Just 2. You picture a public notice. Due to heavy demand for self-control, sunrise has been rescheduled to 4 a.m. The line for pledges shortens. A doctor with a stethoscope and a pamphlet titled Continence and Nerve gives the evening's most earnest sermon. He describes continence as healthful, even heroic. He warns that excess steals strength from mind and industry. The rhetoric crosses into metaphysics. Seed is essence, essence is electricity, electricity is will. Your thoughts hop to an American physician who will soon market carbolic, and to John Harvey Kellogg's sermons about plain food and plain beds, ideas that travel oceans as easily as books. Scholars still argue whether these teachings genuinely improved marriages by encouraging tenderness or merely refitted anxiety with a white coat and a boiled dinner. Spiritualists drift back in with pamphlets that fold sex into spirit more oddly. Some circles whisper about spiritual marriages sanctioned by the beyond rather than the registry. Others preach strict celibacy to keep one's magnetic channel clear for messages. Skeptics point out that dark rooms and fervor can blur boundaries. A few scandals explode, mixing ectoplasm with impropriety in headlines that sell faster than hymns. The Society for Psychical Research, founded in 1882, tries to test phenomena with rulers and notebooks. It catches trickery often enough to make trust difficult and wonders stubborn. You watch sitters argue every result into their pre-existing drawers. Across town, a muscular Christianity lecture packs a YMCA hall. Rowing schedules and Bible verses share a notice board. The steam of the bath is replaced by the steam of boys cooling after calisthenics. If spiritualism feminizes solace, this fashion masculinizes virtue. Build the body, tame the appetite, serve the nation. The gymnasium echoes with the same logic as the seance. Self-mastery framed as health, not so different from the belts and bolsters, just louder and with better ventilation. At a side table, a woman doctor, one of the pioneers with brass on her card, offers a gentler pamphlet about rest, fresh air, and frank talk between spouses. She doubts cold plunges and permanent celibacy for everyone. She believes moderation and kindness do more than vows shouted over harmoniums. Her cue is small but intent. You feel how ideas compete not only in pulpits and parliaments but at trestle tables with lukewarm tea. A man in the aisle stands to share a testimony. After months of water wraps, oatmeal and early nights, he says he feels clearer. His wife smiles the complicated smile of someone who appreciates calm and misses laughter. The room claps on cue. Scholars still argue whether these regimens offered genuine relief from industrial nerves or simply provided a socially approved way to say, "I'm overwhelmed," without using the forbidden grammar of bodies. Perhaps the cure was the permission structure itself. Community, rules, a schedule that gentled the weak. By the time the harmonium sighs its last note, your notebook holds a map of Victorian self-help. Seances to heal grief, water to cool the pulse, vegetables to smooth the calendar, corsets loosened for breath and bargaining, temperance pledges to police the evening, lectures that promise heroism by subtraction. The thread through them all is the same. A hope that quieting the body will quiet the mind, that controlling appetite will conjure serenity. Just 3. If serenity could be bottled, it would be taxed by Monday and sold at the chemist as magnetic elixir number 3. You step into the night, and the city exhales coal and pastry. Somewhere a medium taps a table leg with her slipper and swears it wasn't her. Somewhere a hydropath measures a towel with missionary zeal. Somewhere a couple puts a bolster back in the cupboard and chooses kindness instead of a system. The lamps hum, your stride slows. Tonight has taught you that the age's scariest promise may be the gentlest one. That you can be good by vanishing your appetite, that you can be safe by subtracting yourself. Yet the quieter secret you keep hearing in corridors is less austere. It says the body and mind are neighbors, not enemies, and that sometimes peace arrives not by padlocks and pledges, but by the simple grammar of listening. You move through the city as if turning down the lamps one by one, a last slow circuit that lets patterns show where single rooms once hid them. Everywhere you walked, fear tried to build furniture. Belts for bedrooms, bolsters for borders, bells on hems, ledgers on shelves, clauses in statutes, and little brown parcels folded like secrets. Now you tip your head and watch how those contraptions, scandals and campaigns fit together into something untidier than a moral. An era that tried to manage desire with tools and kept discovering that every tool remained the hand that held it. The hardware aisle of anxiety turned briskly profitable. Vulcanized rubber arrived with modern cheer and immediately took 2 jobs: policing youth and preventing pregnancies. Materials don't choose sides, people do. Publishers learned that panic moves copies. Doctors learned that Latin can sell certainty. Magistrates learned that seizures look like safety when stacked in a courtroom like stage props. Quirky tidbit: electrical panaceas crackled through shop windows too. Pulvermockers, galvanic chains and electric belts promised to revive flagging nerves and manly pep with the application of brass, vinegar and optimism. If your pocket buzzed, it was either therapy or a battery that needed a nap. Just one. Somewhere... A gentleman swore the belt worked wonders, and his dresser swore the scorch marks told a different story. You trace the way scandal hammered law into shape. A journalist's maiden tribute set Parliament on fire, and the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885 raised the age of consent to 16 while smuggling in the Labouche clause, a vague net that would later drag poets from drawing rooms to prison yards. A decade earlier, a different blaze had softened iron. Josephine Butler's long campaign toppled the Contagious Diseases Acts, suspended in 1883 and repealed in 1886. After the country decided dignity should not be sacrificed to military efficiency. Tangible fact. Those dates stand like mile markers on this walk. 1857's Matrimonial Causes Act prying divorce from Parliament, 1868's Hickland Test Training Courts to fear a book's worst line, the 1882 Married Women's Property Act letting wives own what they earned RV. Jackson in 1891 forbidding a husband to imprison a wife for conjugal rights. Laws do not arrive in tidy families. They quarrel at the table. Reformers discovered, too, that gadgets could backfire into freedoms. A corset loosened for health made room for bicycles. Bicycles made room for bloomers. Bloomers made room for breath. Breath made room for thinking. Hydropaths preached cold water and found themselves staffing a wellness industry. Yishan halls chased vice and accidentally taught women to read contracts. Photographers sowed art studies and accidentally invented a memory that the state could not entirely burn. Scholars still argue whether the Victorian sexual order was chiefly repression with good stationery or a noisy renegotiation that swapped older tyrannies for new bargains. More privacy for some, more paperwork for others. Industry, medicine, and religion each tried to be the architect of serenity. Factories demanded punctual bodies. Sermons demanded obedient ones. Clinics demanded measurable ones. You watched all three reach for measuring tapes at once. Bodies obliged and refused in equal measure. The panic over masturbation built a catalogue of devices that made nightwear resemble travel gear. It also taught a generation to name their own experience against printed thunder. The hysteria diagnosis stuffed a continent of female exhaustion into a single Greek root. It also opened cracks through which quieter physicians and the first women doctors slipped, offering rest plus respect instead of rest plus rules. Jest 2. If respect had been patentable, half the city would have retired on the royalties, and the other half would have queued for the improved model. The camera turned out to be the century's mischievous clerk, writing down everything. It catalogued families, yes, but also fantasies. It bound Empire and Eros into albums labeled types, then made it hard to pretend that seeing and knowing are the same. Ethnography claimed a neutral gaze and returned home with souvenirs that shaped desire at the mantelpiece. Meanwhile, private cabinet cards slipped past censors in brown paper, while public tableaux vivants let audiences applaud honesty disguised as marble. The more memory mechanized, the less authority could rely on forgetting as a policy. You put a fingertip to the city's legal web and feel the vibrations of unintended consequences. Hicklin's rule taught writers to master innuendo. The private case taught scholars to read two catalogues. The official and the whispered. The Labouche clause turned parks and letters into risks, and in doing so, taught queer lives a counter-choreography of glances, codes, and houses where tenderness could breathe for an evening. The repeal of the Contagious Diseases regime did not end stigma, but it moved the conversation from custody toward consent. The Married Women's Property Acts did not equalize marriages overnight, but they put keys into pockets that had previously been decorative. Class threaded through everything like a seam you could feel with your eyes closed. Respectable homes could afford separate rooms, chemists' parcels, and the luxury of euphemism. Working-class rooms had thinner walls and fewer alibis. In brothels, parlor houses, and music halls, survival and wit bought small sovereignties, one evening at a time. When the state knocked, it knocked harder at cheaper doors. When reform visited, it often unpacked rules alongside soup. Scholars still argue whether the period's headline reforms flowed downward with help or stuck like varnish to the middle classes that wrote them. And yet you also saw the steadfast, unflashy technology of consent. In a house with a birch and a bell, rules protected pleasure against bravado. In marriages where tenderness counted more than timetables, bolsters retired to linen closets, and the word no learned a gentler grammar. In clinics that stopped scolding and started observing, evidence replaced invective, grain by grain. The century kept threatening to solve people with equipment. People quietly solved themselves with agreements. By the last turn of your circuit, the city feels less like a lecture and more like a palimpsest. Sermons written over gossip, written over need, written over law, written over hope. Myths cling like soot. The Guiana legs are fine, but some inventions linger usefully. Safer surgery, antisepsis, cleaner streets, women's signatures on bank papers, bicycles in parks, photographs of faces that won't vanish. Scandals left dents in statutes. Statutes left doors ajar. Just 3. The age set out to build a chastity engine and accidentally invented a lot of modernity, which is very on brand for a people who could design the perfect teapot and still burn the toast. You stop at the curb where the fog thins to a veil and realize the most terrifying Victorian practice was not belts, birches, or even laws. It was certainty. The calm, thunderous belief that bodies could be hammered into virtue like iron into rail. What survived them was less theatrical and more stubborn. Care, craft, and the slow, boring heroism of listening. The lamps hiss, a baker pulls early loaves. Somewhere a mission door closes softly. Somewhere a photographer rinses a plate and hangs it up like a captured second. You exhale and let the city put away its props. Tomorrow will be ordinary. Tonight you learned where ordinary came from. You let your shoulders drop as if unhooking a heavy coat. The streets soften into a ribbon of quiet light, and the rooms we visited drift backward like lantern slides. Fog and lace, bells and ledgers, bicycles and cabinets, a green carnation pressed between book pages. You don't need all the details anymore. Let them blur a little. The way evening rain blurs a window until the whole city looks like a painting that wants you to sleep. Breathe in, slow and simple. Imagine the old gas lamps turning down one by one. Each flame a tiny thought nodding off. The corsets in their drawers loosen. The ledgers close. The camera lids click shut. Even the jokes set their teacups down and lean back in their chairs. You are not walking now. You are floating past doorways that all agree to stay closed. The hardware of fear, the heavy words, the busy rules. Tonight they decide to be furniture again. Quiet, steady, harmless. If a worry wanders in, give it a seat by the window and let it watch the rain. If a scene returns too sharply, soften it with small kindnesses. A warm cup, a folded quilt, a cat claiming half the pillow with the confidence of an empress. Think of the places where people made their own peace in spite of the thunder. 2 friends sharing tea, a doctor choosing patience, a couple learning the rhythm that suits them rather than the timetable on the mantle. The city exhales with you. Fog settles into a blanket, not a veil. Footsteps far away become the softest metronome. The last lamp sighs and grows dim. You don't have to hold the story anymore. Let it hold you. Light as breath, warm as a hand resting on yours in the dark. Rest easy. You made it through the maze and out the other side. Nothing to do now but drift. Good night. Sweet dreams.